Hey there, night owls! Tonight we're stepping aboard the most legendary floating palace that ever sailed, and I'm not talking about some Instagram influencer's yacht. We're talking about RMS Titanic, First Class 1912. The place. You've seen the movie. You know the iceberg. But here's what James Cameron didn't have time to show you between all that Leonardo DiCaprio hand-holding. What it actually felt like to be one of the wealthiest people on Earth, floating across the Atlantic in a vessel that made modern cruise ships look like they ordered their furniture from IKEA. We're talking 11-course dinners, electric horses in the gymnasium, and a level of luxury so excessive it would make a sultan blush. So before we set sail, hit that like button if you're ready for this deep dive into Edwardian excess, and drop a comment, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Now dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's travel back to April 1912, when the largest moving object ever built by human hands was about to embark on a journey nobody would ever forget. Ready? Let's go. To understand what it meant to board the Titanic in first class, you first need to understand what the world looked like in the spring of 1912. This wasn't just another year, another ship, another voyage across the Atlantic. This was the absolute peak of a very specific moment in human history. A golden afternoon of technological optimism and social hierarchy that would be shattered forever just a few years later by the First World War. But in April 1912, nobody knew that yet. The future looked bright. Progress seemed inevitable. And if you had money, really spectacular amounts of money, the world was essentially your oyster bar, which the Titanic's first-class dining room would serve you on actual silver platters. The RMS Titanic represented something more than just transportation. She was a statement, a declaration, a middle finger to the gods of the sea rendered in steel and rivets. At 882 feet long and 175 feet high, she was the largest moving object ever created by human hands. To put that in perspective, if you stood her on end, she'd be taller than most skyscrapers of the era. She weighed 46,228 tons fully loaded, which is roughly equivalent to 400 blue whales, though considerably less likely to sing to you. The ship cost $7.5 million to build, which in today's money would be somewhere north of $400 million, though frankly trying to compare Edwardian and modern currency is a bit like trying to explain TikTok to Queen Victoria. This wasn't White Star Line's first rodeo with luxury liners. They'd already launched Titanic's older sister, the Olympic, which had been making successful crossings since 1911. But Titanic was meant to be the improved version, the upgrade, the deluxe model. She had fancier restaurants, more elaborate decorations, better accommodations. If Olympic was a Mercedes, Titanic was a Rolls-Royce, assuming Rolls-Royce made vehicles that could hold 2,435 passengers and crew while serving French cuisine and providing Turkish baths. The competition between shipping lines in this era was fierce, not unlike modern airlines competing for business-class passengers, except with significantly more mahogany panelling and approximately 100% more orchestras. The Edwardian era, for those who aren't deeply versed in British historical periods that all sound vaguely similar, refers to the reign of King Edward VII, from 1901 to 1910. By 1912, technically Edward was dead and George III was on the throne, but the social attitudes and aesthetic preferences of those years lingered like expensive perfume in a closed room. It was an age of conspicuous consumption, of rigid social hierarchies, of knowing exactly where you stood in the pecking order and making absolutely certain everyone else knew it too. If you were rich, you displayed that wealth openly, obviously, and with as much ornament as humanly possible. Subtlety was for people who couldn't afford better. The maiden voyage of a ship like Titanic was a major social event, not just a method of getting from Southampton to New York. For the wealthy passengers booking first-class tickets, this wasn't about the destination, it was about the journey itself. It was about being seen, about being part of history, about crossing the Atlantic in the most luxurious, most talked about, most prestigious vessel ever to sail. It was the 1912 equivalent of scoring tickets to the most exclusive event of the season, except this event lasted a week and included your own private stateroom with a four-poster bed. The passenger list for that maiden voyage read like a who's who of American and British wealth. John Jacob Astor IV, one of the richest men in the world, was aboard with his new young wife, causing quite the scandal since he'd divorced his first wife to marry her, which in 1912 social terms was roughly equivalent to announcing you were joining a motorcycle gang. Benjamin Guggenheim was there, of the mining fortune Guggenheims. Isidore and Ida Strauss, who owned Macy's department store, were celebrating their anniversary with a European trip. Margaret Brown, who would later be known as the unsinkable Molly Brown, though she never actually went by Molly and would have been quite confused by the nickname, was returning from travels abroad. These weren't people who needed to travel. They could have stayed home in their mansions and been perfectly comfortable. But being aboard Titanic meant something. It meant you were important enough, wealthy enough, connected enough to be part of this moment. The ship herself was designed to cater to exactly this crowd. White Star Line understood their market. They knew that American millionaires and British aristocrats didn't just want to cross the Atlantic. They wanted to do it while maintaining the exact same standard of living they enjoyed in their Fifth Avenue mansions or their country estates. Actually, they wanted something even better than what they had at home, because what's the point of spending a fortune on a ticket if you're not getting something special? So White Star Line essentially took the finest hotels in Europe, the most elegant private clubs in London, the grandest country houses in England, and somehow managed to fit all of that luxury onto a ship. It was like someone looked at the concept of too much and said, "Challenge accepted." The designers drew inspiration from various historical periods and styles, because in Edwardian interior design, more was more and subtlety was for the middle class. You had Louis XV style here, Jacobean style there, a bit of Italian Renaissance in this corner, some Georgian elegance over there. Walking through the first-class areas of Titanic was like taking a tour through European architectural history, except everything was new, and everything was expensive, and everything was meant to make you feel like you'd somehow transcended the normal human experience of being on a boat in the middle of the ocean. Which, to be fair, you kind of had, because most boats in 1912 did not come with grand staircases carved from English oak, or smoking rooms that looked like gentlemen's clubs transported whole from London's West End. The ship was essentially a floating advertisement for British manufacturing and design prowess. This wasn't just about moving rich people across the Atlantic. This was about showing the world what Britain could do, what modern engineering could accomplish, what humanity could achieve when it combined industrial might with artistic vision and enormous amounts of money. The Titanic was meant to prove that humans had conquered the ocean, that we tamed nature, that we could build something so magnificent and so safe that the sea itself would have to acknowledge our superiority. This attitude, historians have noted with the benefit of hindsight, may have been slightly premature. But on April 10, 1912, when Titanic prepared to leave Southampton on her maiden voyage, none of that mattered. The ship was beautiful, she was enormous, she was practically unsinkable according to the marketing materials, which never actually claimed she was completely unsinkable, but certainly implied it heavily enough that everyone got the message. The ship had 16 watertight compartments and could float with 4 of them flooded, which seemed like plenty of safety margin to everyone involved. She had the latest wireless telegraph equipment, electric lights throughout the first-class areas, electric heaters in the staterooms, even electric elevators, which in 1912 was still novel enough to be exciting rather than boring infrastructure you avoid eye contact in. For the passengers preparing to board, this voyage represented the pinnacle of modern travel. You could cross from the old world to the new world in complete comfort, never sacrificing any of the amenities of civilized life, never having to acknowledge that you were actually on a boat in the middle of a very large, very cold, very indifferent ocean. You would eat exquisite meals prepared by French chefs, sleep in rooms with genuine copper bath fixtures, exercise in a gymnasium with the latest equipment, even swim in a heated saltwater pool, which honestly sounds luxurious now and was basically sorcery in 1912. The Atlantic Ocean was no longer an obstacle to be endured, but an opportunity to be pampered. This was the world that first-class passengers were entering when they booked their tickets on Titanic. A world where technology served luxury, where money could buy not just comfort but genuine splendor, where the impossible had become merely expensive. It was the culmination of decades of competition between shipping lines, each trying to outdo the others in elegance and amenities. And Titanic was meant to be the final word in that competition, the ship that would make all other ships look inadequate by comparison. For one glorious maiden voyage, she absolutely succeeded in that goal. What happened after that? Well, we'll get to that eventually, but first we need to talk about what it took to actually prepare for a journey on this floating palace, because simply showing up with a suitcase was not going to cut it, not even slightly. If you think packing for a modern vacation is stressful, with your carry-on liquids in regulation-sized containers and your anxiety about checked baggage fees, let me tell you about what it took to prepare for a first-class voyage on the Titanic. Because showing up with a rolling suitcase and a neck pillow would have gotten you laughed out of Southampton Harbour. First-class travel in 1912 required preparation on a scale that would make a military deployment look casual. You didn't just pack clothes. You packed a wardrobe. Multiple wardrobes, actually. You packed for every conceivable social situation you might encounter during 6 days at sea, and since the social situations were numerous and the tolerance for repetition was zero, this meant bringing approximately 1 metric ton of fabric and accessories. Let's start with the basic mathematics of the situation. A typical first-class passenger was expected to change clothes at least 4 times per day, and that's the minimum for someone who wasn't particularly social. Morning attire for breakfast, day clothes for walking the decks and socializing, tea dress for afternoon tea naturally, evening wear for dinner. That's 4 complete outfits per day for 6 days, which is already 24 outfits before we even get into the complications. But wait, there's more, because you couldn't just wear the same morning dress 6 times. That would be noticed. That would be discussed. That would mark you as someone who was either poor or simply didn't understand how civilized people behaved, and in first-class society, it was hard to say which was worse. For women, the packing situation was particularly elaborate, in ways that would make modern travellers weep with frustration. You needed morning dresses, which were relatively simple affairs, though simple in 1912 terms still meant long sleeves, high necks, skirts that reached the floor, and enough fabric to upholster a small sofa. You needed afternoon dresses for socializing, which were slightly more elaborate. You needed tea gowns, which were theoretically more relaxed but still required a corset because apparently comfort was for peasants. And then you needed evening gowns, multiple evening gowns, each more elaborate than the last, with trains and beading and embroidery, and all the delicate details that said, "I have servants to maintain my clothing and I'm not afraid to use them." But the dresses were just the beginning. Each hats for daytime, because no respectable woman went outdoors without a hat, and we're not talking about baseball caps here, we're talking about elaborate constructions of fabric and feathers, and flowers that required hat pins roughly the size of knitting needles to secure to your hair. Different gloves for different occasions. Day gloves, evening gloves, walking gloves, dining gloves. Multiple pairs of shoes because you couldn't wear your walking shoes to dinner, that would be barbaric. Jewellery appropriate to each outfit, which for wealthy women meant travelling with small fortunes in gems, because why wear your everyday diamonds when you could wear your special occasion diamonds? Then there were the undergarments, which in Edwardian times were numerous and complicated in ways that would make modern people grateful for elastic waistbands. Corsets, obviously, because the fashionable silhouette of 1912 required reshaping the entire human torso into something nature never intended. Chemises, which were worn under the corsets to protect your skin from the corset bones. Drawers, which were underwear but required far more fabric than modern underwear because efficiency wasn't really a consideration. Petticoats, multiple petticoats, because your dress needed support and volume and God forbid anyone see the actual shape of your legs. Stockings held up with garters because elastic hadn't been invented yet, or at least hadn't made it into respectable ladies' undergarments. All of this had to be packed, organised, and kept track of for the entire voyage. And we haven't even discussed hair. Edwardian hairstyles were elaborate affairs that required help to construct, which is why wealthy women travelled with ladies' maids. You needed pompadour pads to give your hair the proper shape and volume. You needed hairpins, approximately 1 million hairpins, because those elaborate updos weren't held together with hope and good wishes. You needed hair accessories for different occasions, combs and ornaments and ribbons. Some women wore hairpieces to add extra volume or length, which meant packing essentially spare hair. The whole production was exhausting just to think about, and we're still only talking about the women's wardrobes. Men, you might think, had it easier, and in some ways you'd be right. But easier is relative when we're discussing Edwardian social expectations. A first-class gentleman needed morning suits for breakfast and early activities, lounge suits for afternoon socializing, tea jackets for, tea, and formal evening wear for dinner, which wasn't just a tuxedo. Oh no, we're talking full white tie and tails, the same level of formality you'd wear to meet royalty or attend the opera, except you were wearing it to eat dinner on a boat. Every single night. Because standards. The formal evening wear alone was a production. White piqué waistcoat, which had to be actually white, not off-white or cream, or, well, it's white enough. White bow tie, also genuinely white, tied by hand because clip-ons hadn't been invented and wouldn't have been acceptable anyway. Black tailcoat with silk facings. Formal trousers with braiding down the sides. Patent leather shoes that required careful maintenance. White gloves for particularly formal occasions. And a top hat, naturally, because apparently your head wasn't complete without several inches of silk-covered stiffened felt balanced on top of it. But here's where it gets truly ridiculous: shirts. Men's formal shirts in 1912 had detachable collars and cuffs, which sounds convenient until you realize it meant you needed to pack dozens of collars and cuffs separately from your shirts. The collars were stiff, uncomfortable things made of heavily starched fabric that dug into your neck and restricted your movement. Sort of like wearing a cardboard tube around your throat, except cardboard would probably have been more comfortable. These collars had to be absolutely pristine and stiff, which meant they wilted after one wearing and needed to be laundered and restarched. So wealthy men travelling on Titanic packed entire boxes full of just collars. Not shirts, just the collars. It was like packing 100 tiny neck prisons to torture yourself with over the course of the voyage. The cuffs were equally elaborate. Detachable cuffs that buttoned onto the shirt sleeves, requiring cufflinks to secure them, which meant you also needed multiple sets of cufflinks, because wearing the same ones every night would be noticed and silently judged. And since formal shirts were meant to be worn with studs instead of buttons down the front, you needed sets of shirt studs as well, preferably in precious metals or mother of pearl or some other material that announced you could afford to have tiny jewellery holding your shirt closed. All of these items required proper storage and organisation. Wealthy passengers travelled with steamer trunks, which were enormous upright suitcases designed specifically for sea travel. These trunks were marvels of organisation, with multiple drawers and compartments and hanging space, basically portable closets that could hold dozens of outfits and all their accessories. A typical first-class passenger might travel with 4 or more of these trunks, each weighing over 100 pounds when full. The trunks themselves were status symbols, made from leather or canvas with leather trim, covered in travel stickers from previous voyages, hardware in brass or nickel, and the owner's initials prominently displayed because obviously everyone needed to know whose magnificent luggage this was. Inside the trunks, everything had to be carefully packed to prevent wrinkling, which was a genuine concern given that these were the days before wrinkle-free fabrics or steam irons in every stateroom. Dresses were packed with tissue paper between the folds. Delicate items were wrapped separately. Shoes were stuffed with paper to keep their shape. Hats were packed in special hat boxes, usually carried separately because crushing a good hat was roughly equivalent to destroying a small work of art. Then there were the cosmetics and toiletries, which in 1912 were becoming increasingly elaborate for women, though of course no respectable woman would admit to wearing makeup. Heavens no. She was just naturally blessed with perfectly tinted cheeks and lips. Hairbrush, combs of various sizes, hand mirrors, perfumes and colognes in glass bottles that had to be carefully packed to prevent breakage. Skin creams and lotions, which wealthy women used despite the prevailing beauty standard being pale skin that suggested you never went outside, the exact opposite of modern tanning culture. Tooth powder, because toothpaste in tubes was still relatively new. Various powders and potions and treatments that promised to maintain youth and beauty through the magic of usually lead-based cosmetics that were slowly poisoning their users. Men had their own toiletry requirements, though generally less extensive. Shaving equipment, which in 1912 meant straight razors that required skill to use without slicing your own face open. Shaving soap and brushes. Pomade for the hair, because the slicked-back look was fashionable and wasn't going to achieve itself. Moustache wax if you wore a moustache, and many men did because facial hair was still respectable. Cologne, though not too much, because smelling like you'd bathed in flowers was considered effeminate. Various grooming tools, brushes and combs, and nail scissors and the like. All of this, and we still haven't covered the miscellaneous items that wealthy travellers considered essential. Books for entertainment, because this was before smartphones or tablets or even decent ship libraries. Writing materials for correspondence, because keeping up with your social obligations meant writing letters constantly. Playing cards for the card games that filled so many hours of the voyage. Perhaps a camera, though photography in 1912 required substantial equipment and actual film. Medications, because getting sick at sea was common and you wanted to be prepared. Jewellery cases for the women's gems, often elaborate boxes with multiple layers and compartments, locked because travelling with tens of thousands of dollars in jewellery required some security consciousness. Some passengers brought even more unusual items. Trunks full of purchases from European shopping trips. Artwork and antiques being shipped back to American mansions. Musical instruments for those who played. One passenger famously brought a custom-made automobile that was being shipped in the cargo hold, because apparently it was easier to bring your car across the ocean than to simply buy one in America. The wealthy approached travel the way modern people approach moving house, bringing essentially their entire lifestyle with them, rather than adapting to circumstances. The physical process of getting all this luggage from your home to the ship was an operation in itself. Horse-drawn wagons or early automobiles would be loaded with the trunks. Servants would accompany the luggage to ensure nothing went missing. At the port, you'd navigate through crowds of passengers and crew, through the chaos of embarkation day, while porters and stewards moved your mountain of belongings. The logistics were complicated enough that wealthy passengers often arrived hours early just to ensure everything was loaded properly. Once aboard, the stewards would unpack your trunks in your stateroom, hanging your clothes in the wardrobes, arranging your toiletries in the washroom, organising everything so you could simply step into your floating home and find all your possessions exactly where they should be. This service was included in your first-class ticket price, which started at about $870 for a basic first-class cabin and went up to over $4,000 for the most elaborate suites, roughly equivalent to $25,000 to $115,000 today. For that price, you could expect that someone else would do all the actual work of moving and organising your belongings, while you settled in with perhaps a cup of tea and a pleasant view of the harbour. The social pressure to have the right wardrobe cannot be overstated. First-class society on Titanic was a microcosm of the broader social world these people inhabited, with all its unwritten rules and careful hierarchies. What you wore signalled who you were, where you came from, whether you truly belonged in these elevated circles or were just someone with money trying to buy their way in. The difference between old money and new money could often be read in the details of someone's clothing. Old money favoured quality and tradition, garments that were expensive but not showy, that suggested generations of good taste and proper breeding. New money often went for flash and obvious expense, the latest fashions regardless of whether they were actually flattering, anything that screamed "I can afford this" to everyone in sight. For women especially, being seen in the same outfit twice was a minor social catastrophe. They would discuss it quietly among themselves. They would draw conclusions about your financial situation or your social awareness. It sounds absurd, obsessing over whether someone wore the same dress on Tuesday and Thursday, but in a world where your social standing determined almost everything about your life, these details mattered. Your clothing was your armour, your advertisement, your proof that you belonged among the elite. The dresses themselves were works of art and engineering. This was the tail end of the Edwardian era, when women's fashion was transitioning from the S-curve corset silhouette to the slightly more natural lines that would characterise the 1910s, though natural is a generous description for a style that still required substantial undergarments and produced a shape that no human body naturally possesses. The ideal silhouette featured a full bust, a tiny waist and full hips, basically an hourglass figure taken to extremes that required serious structural support to achieve. The dresses were made from luxurious fabrics, silk, satin, velvet, lace, sometimes all on the same garment. They featured elaborate details, embroidery done by hand, beading that took hundreds of hours to apply, appliqué work that required serious skill. A single high-end evening gown could cost hundreds of dollars in 1912 money, equivalent to thousands today, and wealthy women had dozens of them. The famous fashion houses of Paris and London provided many of these garments. Names like Worth, Paquin, Lucille, Poiret were stamped inside the dresses of the truly fashionable. Having a wardrobe from these designers marked you as someone with not just money but taste, someone who was part of the international set that followed fashion closely. Some first-class passengers had been in Paris specifically for the spring collections, buying entire wardrobes from the latest shows, and the maiden voyage of Titanic was partly an opportunity to debut these new purchases to their peers. But not everyone could afford Paris fashion, and that's where the social distinctions became tricky. Some first-class passengers were genuinely, generationally wealthy, people like the Astors and Guggenheims who had fortunes so large they could afford any extravagance without thinking twice. Others were comfortably wealthy, affluent enough for first-class travel but needing to be more careful with their spending. And a few were stretching their budgets to travel first class, wanting the prestige and the connections that came with those social circles, even if it meant economizing in ways the truly wealthy never had to consider. You could sometimes spot these distinctions in the wardrobes, in who wore Paris originals and who wore excellent copies made by expensive dressmakers, in who changed outfits 4 times a day, and who carefully re-wore items in different combinations. The men's formal wear, while less obviously varied than the women's dresses, also came with its own status indicators. The quality of the tailoring, the fit of the coat, the weight and drape of the fabric, these things were noticed by other men who understood the differences. American tailors were improving but still weren't quite at the same level, at least according to British standards of the time, and ready-made formal wear, which was starting to become available, would have been acceptable for middle-class men but never for first-class passengers on Titanic, where everything about your appearance was expected to be bespoke. The requirement to dress formally every single evening was one of the defining features of first-class life at sea. Dinner wasn't just a meal, it was a social performance, a theatre where you were both actor and audience. You dressed for the role you were playing, the role of a person of wealth and sophistication, someone who belonged at the captain's table or in the most exclusive social circles. Showing up to dinner in anything less than full formal wear would have been unthinkable, roughly equivalent to showing up to a wedding in workout clothes today. It simply wasn't done, not if you wanted to maintain your social standing. This meant that every evening involved a complicated transformation. Women would retreat to their staterooms after afternoon tea and begin the process of preparing for dinner, which could take an hour or more with the help of their ladies' maids. The corset had to be laced tightly, which was nearly impossible to do alone and required someone pulling the laces while you held onto furniture and tried to remember how to breathe in a ribcage compressed several inches smaller than nature intended. The evening gown had to be carefully put on, often requiring help because of the elaborate closures and the sheer size and weight of the garments. Hair had to be redressed in a more formal style. Jewellery had to be selected and put on. The whole process was exhausting, and this was happening every single evening of the voyage. Men had a somewhat easier time of it, but still needed to completely change from their day clothes into formal evening wear, ensuring every detail was perfect, every stud in place, every collar crisp. For both men and women, this daily transformation reinforced the separation between casual daytime life and formal evening society. You weren't just changing clothes, you were changing personas, shifting from your relaxed self to your public self, the self that performed wealth and status and sophistication. All of this preparation, all these trunks full of clothing, all these hours spent dressing and redressing, might seem ridiculous from a modern perspective. We live in an age of casual dress codes and comfort-first fashion, where you can show up to a nice restaurant in jeans and nobody blinks. But in 1912, for the people travelling first class on Titanic, these rituals mattered. They were the visible structure of a social order that was already starting to crack, though nobody aboard really knew it yet. These elaborate dress codes, these careful hierarchies of fashion, they were part of a world that would be swept away by the First World War and the social changes that followed. But for this one voyage, this maiden voyage of the greatest ship ever built, everything was still in place. The trunks were packed, the clothes were pressed, the collars were starched, and the wealthy passengers of Titanic were ready to cross the Atlantic in more style than anyone had ever managed before. The absurdity of it all, when you step back and look at it objectively, is actually kind of magnificent. These people were boarding a ship, essentially a large metal boat, to cross an ocean, which is fundamentally a rather utilitarian activity, but they refused to approach it in a utilitarian way. They insisted on bringing their entire world with them, on maintaining every standard and custom and ritual of their normal lives, on pretending that being at sea was no different than being in their city mansions or country estates. It was a triumph of civilization over nature, of social convention over practical reality, or it was an exercise in absurd excess depending on your perspective. Probably both, actually. In any case, by the time the passengers had finished packing and the trunks were loaded and the ship was ready to sail, Titanic was carrying enough fancy clothing to stock several department stores, enough formal wear to outfit hundreds of fancy dinner parties, and enough accessories to make a modern fashion blogger weep with envy. All for 6 days at sea. All because that's what first-class travel required in 1912. All because, when you could afford the absolute best, why would you settle for anything less? So you've spent days packing your 4 steamer trunks full of detachable collars and evening gowns that weigh more than most modern wedding dresses. You've travelled to Southampton with your mountain of luggage and possibly a lady's maid or valet in tow, and now you're finally standing at the dock looking up at the RMS Titanic for the first time. And the first thing you think is probably something along the lines of, good God, that's not a ship, that's a floating city. Because the sheer physical size of Titanic was genuinely difficult for the human brain to process, especially in 1912 when the tallest buildings in the world were barely over 600 feet, and most people lived in structures that were maybe 3 stories high. The ship stretched 882 feet from bow to stern, which is just under 3 football fields laid end to end, if football fields existed in the ocean and were made of steel and could house over 2,000 people. From the waterline to the top of her funnels she stood 175 feet tall, which is roughly equivalent to a 17-story building, except buildings generally stay in one place and don't move through water at 23 knots. Try to picture that for a moment. A 17-story building that floats. A structure the length of 3 football fields that you're about to live inside while it crosses 3,000 miles of ocean. The engineering alone was staggering, but what really got people's attention was that this massive floating steel structure didn't look industrial or utilitarian, or anything like what you'd expect a ship to look like. It looked elegant. It looked refined. It looked like someone had taken a grand hotel and convinced it to go sailing. The exterior hull was painted black with white superstructure, the classic colour scheme that made the ship look sleek and modern, while also hiding the inevitable coal dust that drifted from the funnels. Those 4 funnels, by the way, were one of Titanic's most distinctive features, towering over the decks and visible for miles. They were painted in White Star Line's signature buff yellow colour topped with black, and they looked impressive and powerful, which was rather the point. Though here's a fun fact that White Star Line didn't advertise. Only 3 of those 4 funnels were actually functional. The 4th one was essentially a decoration, added to make the ship look more powerful and balanced, because apparently even in 1912 we understood that sometimes aesthetics matter more than function. It did serve as ventilation for the engine room, so it wasn't completely useless, but it wasn't actually expelling smoke from the boilers like the other 3. This was essentially the 1912 equivalent of putting fake air vents on a car to make it look sportier. Approaching the ship for boarding, first-class passengers would have entered through the main entrance on the port side midship. This wasn't just a doorway, this was a statement. The entrance was designed to look like the doorway to a mansion, with polished wood surrounds and gleaming brass fixtures, because White Star Line wanted you to forget you were boarding a ship, and instead feel like you were arriving at an exclusive estate. Stewards in crisp white uniforms stood ready to greet passengers, check tickets, and direct people to their accommodations. The whole operation was designed to be smooth and impressive, to immediately establish that this was not an ordinary travel experience. Once you stepped through that entrance, you found yourself in a reception area that would have looked perfectly at home in any luxury hotel of the era. Polished wood panelling covered the walls. Electric lights provided illumination that was still novel enough to be exciting rather than mundane. The carpet under your feet was thick and expensive, probably worth more per square foot than most people's monthly rent. And everywhere you looked, there were staff members ready to assist you, because first-class service meant never having to figure anything out for yourself. Someone would show you to your stateroom. Someone would help with your luggage. Someone would explain the ship's layout and the daily schedule. You were, from the moment you stepped aboard, cocooned in a bubble of service and luxury that would continue for the entire voyage. But before you made it to your stateroom, before you even thought about unpacking or settling in, there was one sight that every first-class passenger encountered, one feature of the ship that defined the entire first-class experience and became the most photographed and discussed element of Titanic's design. The grand staircase. And calling it a staircase is a bit like calling the Sistine Chapel a room with a nice ceiling. Technically accurate, but missing the entire point. The grand staircase was located in the forward part of the first-class section, running from the boat deck down to E-deck, spanning 6 levels of the ship. It was the primary vertical circulation route for first-class passengers, which is a fancy way of saying it was how you got from one deck to another, but that description makes it sound functional and boring, which it absolutely was not. This staircase was a piece of architecture, a work of art, a technical achievement, and a social stage all rolled into one spectacular feature that cost more money than most people would see in their entire lives. The centerpiece of the grand staircase, the element everyone noticed immediately, was the dome at the top. This wasn't just any dome. This was a wrought iron and glass dome that let natural light flood down through all 6 levels of the staircase, illuminating the entire space with daylight during the day and creating a spectacular play of light and shadow on the carved wood and wrought iron details. The glass was arranged in an elaborate pattern. The ironwork was ornate and delicate, and the whole effect was like standing inside a very expensive jewellery box designed by someone who believed that subtlety was for people without enough money to do things properly. The staircase itself was carved from solid English oak, which in 1912 was expensive enough that using this much of it in one location was basically a flex on the part of White Star Line. Oak everywhere. Oak banisters, oak newel posts, oak panelling on the walls, and not just plain oak either, but carved oak with elaborate decorative details that required actual craftsmen to create, not machines. The wood was polished until it gleamed, maintained constantly by crew members whose entire job was apparently to ensure that the woodwork stayed immaculate, despite hundreds of first-class passengers running their hands along the banisters daily. At the centre of the staircase, positioned where everyone descending from the boat deck would see it immediately, was a carved panel featuring a clock surrounded by an allegorical sculpture. The figures on either side of the clock represented honour and glory crowning time, which is either a profound statement about the relationship between human achievement and mortality, or just a fancy way to decorate a clock, depending on how philosophical you're feeling. The sculpture was elaborate and expensive looking, which was probably the main point, though it also served as a constant reminder to first-class passengers that they were not on an ordinary ship but on something special, something that cared about art and beauty and making everyday objects into statements of sophistication. The balustrades along the staircase were made of ornate wrought iron with gilt detailing, because apparently plain wrought iron wasn't fancy enough. The iron was worked into elaborate curves and patterns, the kind of metalwork that requires serious skill to produce and even more money to commission. And the gilt, the gold leaf applied to portions of the ironwork, caught the light from the dome above and created highlights that made the entire staircase seem to glow. It was dramatic, it was impressive, and it absolutely achieved the intended effect of making everyone who saw it think, these people spent a fortune on this ship. But the grand staircase wasn't just about visual impact, it was also about function, or more specifically, it was about social function. This staircase was the primary route between the boat deck, where passengers could promenade and take the air, and the lower decks where the dining rooms and smoking rooms and other social spaces were located, which meant that everyone walking between these areas would pass through this central space, would see and be seen on these dramatic stairs. The grand staircase was essentially a stage for the daily performance of first-class society, a place where you could make an entrance descending the stairs in your finest evening wear, where you could see who else was aboard the ship, where you could be noticed by the right people. Young women in their elaborate evening gowns would descend these stairs on their way to dinner, fully aware that everyone below could see them, that their dresses and jewellery and bearing were all being observed and evaluated. Wealthy men in their formal evening wear would stand at the bottom of the stairs, watching the parade of fashion and beauty, perhaps offering a greeting to acquaintances, definitely noting who was wearing what and who was travelling with whom. The staircase facilitated movement between decks, sure, but more importantly it facilitated the social connections and observations that were the real point of first-class travel. You didn't take an elevator if you were trying to see and be seen. You used the lighting in the staircase area was carefully designed to enhance this theatrical quality. During the day, natural light from the dome above provided illumination that showed off the wood and metalwork to best advantage. In the evening, electric lights in ornate fixtures provided a warmer glow that was romantic and flattering, making everyone look their best as they descended to dinner. The fixtures themselves were works of art, bronze or gilt metal with glass shades, positioned to provide light without harsh shadows. The whole lighting scheme was designed by people who understood that luxury isn't just about expensive materials, it's about creating an atmosphere, an experience, a feeling that you've transcended ordinary life and entered something special. At the base of the grand staircase on the D-deck landing was the reception area, where the purser's office was located. This was the administrative heart of the passenger operation, where you could exchange currency, store valuables in the ship's safe, send telegrams via the wireless room, or handle any issues that arose during the voyage. Having this area positioned right at the grand staircase meant it was easily accessible, but also meant that everyone passing through the central circulation route of the ship would see the activity here, would be reminded that this massive vessel had systems and staff managing every detail of the passenger experience. Now, the grand staircase was impressive, certainly, but it wasn't the only architectural achievement in the first-class areas. The entire first-class section of the ship was designed as a coherent whole, a series of interconnected spaces that together created an environment of luxury that was meant to rival, and ideally exceed, the best hotels and private mansions of the era. White Star Line hired some of the finest designers and craftsmen in Britain to create these spaces, and the result was interiors that represented the peak of Edwardian decorative arts. The first-class dining saloon, located on D-deck, was the largest room afloat at the time. It could seat over 500 passengers at once, which required a space that stretched 114 feet long and 92 feet wide. To put that in perspective, that's roughly equivalent to a basketball court, except instead of a basketball court it was filled with tables covered in white linen, fine china, crystal glassware and fresh flowers. The ceiling tall windows lined the sides of the room, Though since we're talking about the middle of a ship, these weren't actually windows to the outside, but rather windows looking out onto enclosed promenades, which still provided a sense of openness and light. The dining room was decorated in Jacobean style, which was a callback to early 17th century English design, all dark oak panelling and ornate carved details. The furniture was upholstered in rich fabrics, the chairs substantial and comfortable, because you were going to be sitting through 11-course dinners that could easily last 2 hours or more. The tables were arranged to accommodate different party sizes, from intimate tables for two to larger tables for groups, and the most prestigious location was the tables near the centre of the room, particularly those closest to the captain's table, where the most important passengers would be invited to dine with the ship's officers. The room was designed to impress, certainly, but also to function efficiently. The kitchen was located directly adjacent, connected by a series of swinging doors through which white-coated waiters would move in a choreographed dance of service, delivering courses simultaneously to hundreds of diners. The room had to look elegant while also handling the practical reality of feeding hundreds of wealthy, demanding passengers multiple times per day. It was a triumph of both design and logistics, creating an environment that felt exclusive and refined while actually being a fairly large-scale operation that would have made a modern restaurant manager weep with admiration at the coordination involved. Adjacent to the dining saloon was the reception room, another beautifully designed space that served as a waiting area before dinner and a place for after-dinner coffee and socializing. This room was decorated in a lighter style than the dining room, with white painted paneling and delicate furniture that gave it a more relaxed feeling. The reception room featured a grand piano, because apparently no luxury liner was complete without the ability to provide live music, and passengers would gather here before dinner to chat and see who else was dining that evening. It was another one of those transitional spaces that facilitated the social mixing and observation that was such an important part of first-class life. The first-class lounge, located on a deck, was designed to be the drawing room equivalent for the ship, a place where passengers could relax during the day in an environment that felt like a refined private home rather than a public space. This room was decorated in Louis XV style, which is French decorative arts from the mid-18th century, characterized by elaborate curved forms, gilt detailing, and generally just a lot of visual complexity. The furniture was upholstered in expensive fabrics with carved wooden frames. The walls featured paneling and decorative plasterwork. There were tall windows with elaborate curtains, oriental rugs on the floor and artwork on the walls. The whole room was designed to feel sophisticated and cultured, a place where wealthy passengers could spend their afternoons reading, conversing, or perhaps playing cards while surrounded by beauty and comfort. The reading and writing room, also on A deck, was designed specifically for female passengers, which tells you something about Edwardian social conventions. This room was decorated in Georgian style, which is 18th century English design characterized by symmetry and classical proportions, and it featured light colors and delicate furniture that were considered appropriately feminine. The room had writing desks where women could compose letters, comfortable chairs for reading, and windows that looked out onto the promenade deck. It was a quiet, refined space that offered women a retreat from the more social areas of the ship, though of course the whole point of being in a semi-public space like this was that you weren't actually retreating from society, but rather engaging with it in a different mode. The smoking room, located on a deck at the aft end of the ship, was the male equivalent of the reading and writing room, a space reserved exclusively for men where they could smoke cigars, drink whiskey, and engage in the kind of conversation that Edwardian men apparently couldn't have in the presence of women. This room was decorated in Georgian style as well, but in a much darker, heavier version with mahogany paneling, leather furniture, and stained glass windows featuring scenes that would appeal to masculine sensibilities. The room had a bar, naturally, because what's the point of a men's smoking room without alcohol, and it was designed to feel like a London gentleman's club, all dark wood and leather, and the smell of expensive tobacco. The smoking room was where a lot of the serious business of the voyage happened, at least from the male passenger's perspective. This was where deals were discussed, where political conversations took place, where men could relax away from the performative aspects of mixed company and just be themselves, or at least be the version of themselves that they presented to other wealthy men. Card games happened here, both friendly games among acquaintances and higher stakes games involving professional gamblers who made their living fleecing wealthy passengers on transatlantic crossings. The room stayed open late into the night, long after the rest of the ship had settled down, because apparently wealthy Edwardian men had both the energy and the liver capacity to stay up until 2 a.m. smoking cigars and drinking brandy. The Café Parisien was a new addition on Titanic, not present on the Olympic, and it represented White Star Line's attempt to bring a bit of continental flair to the ship. This café was designed to look like a French sidewalk café, with wicker furniture, ivy-covered trellises, and large windows that gave the illusion of outdoor seating, even though you were, in fact, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The Café Parisien served lighter meals and was particularly popular with younger passengers who wanted something less formal than the main dining saloon. It was decorated in a lighter, more relaxed style than most of the other first-class spaces, and it represented a slight shift toward more casual dining options, though casual in this context still meant you needed to be properly dressed and well-behaved. The Veranda Café was located on the boat deck and served as an indoor-outdoor space where passengers could enjoy refreshments while taking in the sea air. It had both enclosed and open sections with wicker furniture and potted plants creating a garden-like atmosphere. This was where you'd go for afternoon tea, for a light lunch, or just to sit and read while enjoying the view of the ocean. The Veranda Café was designed to be relaxing and refreshing, a place where the rigid formality of other first-class spaces was slightly relaxed, though of course you still couldn't show up in anything less than appropriate daywear. All of these public rooms were connected by corridors that were themselves impressive, with the same attention to detail and expensive finishes that characterized the larger spaces. The corridors featured carved wood paneling, patterned carpet runners, electric lighting and decorative fixtures, and generally just a level of finish that made it clear you were in the first-class section of the ship. Even the transitional spaces, the hallways and stairwells, were designed to maintain the illusion that you were in an elegant building rather than on a boat. Now let's talk about the staterooms, because this is where the real variation in first-class accommodations became apparent. First class on Titanic wasn't a single experience, but rather a range of experiences depending on how much you'd paid for your ticket. At the lower end, you had relatively modest single cabins that might measure around 100 square feet, which is roughly the size of a small college dorm room. These cabins would have a bed, a washstand, perhaps a small sofa, and not much else. They were finished nicely, certainly, with wood paneling and decent furniture, but they weren't palatial. They were comfortable and respectable, appropriate for someone travelling alone who wanted first-class status but didn't need elaborate accommodations. Moving up the scale, you had larger cabins with sitting areas, perhaps a separate bedroom, private bathroom facilities which were still relatively rare in 1912 homes, and absolutely luxurious on a ship. These cabins might have portholes or windows providing natural light and views of the ocean. The furniture would be more elaborate, the finishes more expensive. These were accommodations suitable for couples or families who wanted comfort and space during the voyage. And then, at the very top of the first-class hierarchy, you had the special suites, and this is where things got truly absurd. The two most expensive accommodations on Titanic were the promenade suites on B-deck, which were genuinely apartment-sized. These suites featured a sitting room, 2 bedrooms, 2 wardrobe rooms for all those clothes we discussed earlier, a private bathroom, and most impressively, a private promenade deck, an outdoor space of about 50 feet long that was exclusive to the suite. These suites were decorated in different period styles with carved wood paneling, ornate plasterwork, expensive furniture, and every luxury amenity available. Having a private outdoor space on a ship was incredibly rare and incredibly expensive, and it marked you as someone at the absolute top of the wealth hierarchy. The promenade suites were occupied on this voyage by some of the most prominent passengers. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of White Star Line, was in one of them, which made sense since he basically owned the ship. The other was occupied by Charlotte Cardezza, an American heiress travelling with her son, who brought along something like 14 trunks of luggage and a footman to help manage her belongings, because apparently 4 trunks was for amateurs. The price for these suites was 870 yen for the voyage, which translates to roughly $100,000 in today's money, or about $125,000, for 6 days, on a boat. Though to be fair, it was a very nice boat with a private deck and probably really good water pressure in the private bathroom. The other first-class staterooms varied in size and luxury, but all shared certain features that marked them as first-class accommodations. The beds were real beds, not bunks, with proper mattresses and bedding. The furniture was substantial and well made. The bathrooms, when private, featured proper plumbing fixtures in porcelain and copper, not the basic facilities you'd find in second or third class. Electric heating kept the rooms comfortable even in the North Atlantic cold. Electric call buttons allowed you to summon a steward whenever you needed anything. And the decoration, even in the simpler cabins, maintained a level of refinement that announced you were in first class, not slumming it in the lower decks. What's interesting is how these accommodations compared to what was available on land at the time. For many passengers, even wealthy ones, their staterooms on Titanic might have been better appointed than their bedrooms at home. Remember, this was 1912. Many homes didn't have electric lighting yet. Indoor plumbing was still relatively new and not universal even among the wealthy. Central heating was rare. Air conditioning didn't exist. So a first-class stateroom on Titanic, with its electric lights, private bathroom, thermostat-controlled heating, and generally modern amenities, represented the cutting edge of residential comfort. You were getting hotel-quality accommodations, but at sea, which was genuinely impressive. The comparison to hotels was intentional and heavily marketed by White Star Line. They wanted passengers to think of their ships as floating versions of the finest hotels in Europe and America. The Ritz in Paris, the Savoy in London, the Waldorf Astoria in New York, these were the standards they were competing with and trying to exceed. And in many ways, they succeeded. The public rooms on Titanic were as elaborate and well-appointed as any hotel public spaces. The dining was comparable to fine restaurants. The service was attentive and professional. The main difference was that instead of staying in one place, the hotel was moving across 3,000 miles of ocean at 23 knots, which is either terrifying or thrilling depending on your perspective and possibly your susceptibility to seasickness. The comparison to private mansions was also relevant, particularly for the wealthiest passengers who were used to living in enormous houses with staffs of servants. For someone like John Jacob Astor, who owned multiple mansions and probably couldn't remember all the rooms in his various properties, a stateroom on Titanic, even a suite, was definitely smaller than what he was used to at home. But the ship offered something his mansions couldn't. It moved. It took you places. It combined the comfort of home with the adventure of travel. And it did so while surrounding you with other wealthy, interesting people, creating a temporary community that was part of the appeal of ocean liner travel. The ship also represented the peak of contemporary design and decoration. The various period styles used throughout the first-class spaces, the Louis XV lounge, the Jacobean dining room, the Georgian reading room, these weren't just random choices but rather a carefully curated collection of European decorative arts history. Walking through the first-class areas of Titanic was like taking a tour through several centuries of design, all executed with expensive materials and skilled craftsmanship. It was educational in a way, though probably most passengers were more focused on being impressed than on learning about architectural history. What's remarkable is how quickly all of this was accomplished. Titanic was built in just over 2 years, from keel laying to launch, and the interior fitting took additional months after that. Creating this floating palace, with all its elaborate woodwork and decorative plasterwork and carefully designed spaces, in roughly 3 years total, represents an incredible concentration of labour and skill. Hundreds of craftsmen worked on the ship, carvers and joiners and plasterers and painters and metalworkers and upholsterers, and all the other specialists needed to create these elaborate interiors. The construction of Titanic was one of the largest industrial projects of its time, employing thousands of workers and representing a massive investment of capital and resources. And all this elaborate decoration and comfortable accommodation and technical achievement, was in service of one goal: making wealthy passengers willing to pay premium prices to cross the Atlantic on White Star Line ships, rather than on their competitors. This was a business, after all, not an art project. The luxury wasn't just for its own sake, it was a competitive advantage, a way to attract the richest passengers who had choices about how to travel. And it worked. Titanic's maiden voyage was heavily booked with prominent passengers, people who could afford to travel on any ship but chose Titanic because of her reputation for luxury and comfort. The first impression that passengers had of the ship, walking through that entrance and seeing the grand staircase and exploring the various public rooms, was carefully designed to create a sense of awe and appreciation. This wasn't just a ship. This was an achievement, a demonstration of what human ingenuity could accomplish. And for a few days you got to live inside that achievement, to experience this floating palace, to be part of something remarkable. The tragedy that would eventually befall Titanic makes it hard to discuss these aspects without a sense of foreboding. But for the passengers boarding in Southampton on April 10, 1912, the dominant emotion was probably excitement mixed with pride. They were about to embark on the most luxurious ocean voyage ever offered, aboard the finest ship ever built, and they were among the privileged few wealthy enough and connected enough to be part of this maiden voyage. The architecture and design of Titanic represented not just technical skill, but also a particular worldview, a belief that humans could master nature through technology, that comfort and beauty could be maintained anywhere, even in the middle of the ocean, that money and engineering could overcome any obstacle. The ship was a testament to Edwardian optimism, to faith in progress, to the belief that the future would be better than the past because we would make it so through our own efforts and ingenuity. This worldview was about to be challenged in ways nobody aboard could have predicted. But for now, standing in the grand staircase under that elaborate glass dome, looking at the carved oak and gilt iron, and thinking about the adventure ahead, everything seemed possible. The sheer audacity of it all is what really stands out. Building a ship this large was audacious. Decorating it like a palace was audacious. Charging what amounted to a year's wages for many people just for a one-way ticket was audacious. And passengers paying those prices, bringing their 4 trunks full of clothes, dressing for dinner every night in the middle of the ocean, maintaining all the social rituals and hierarchies of land-based society, while floating along at 23 knots, that was audacious too. The entire enterprise was an exercise in refusing to acknowledge that there might be limits to what money and technology could accomplish. It was magnificent. It was impressive. It was, in hindsight, perhaps a bit overconfident. But that's the thing about first impressions. They're based on appearances, on the immediate experience, on what you can see and touch and feel. And what passengers saw when they first boarded Titanic was something unprecedented. Something that seemed to justify all the hype and expense and anticipation. A true architectural wonder on water, a floating palace that somehow combined the impossible contradiction of massive industrial might with delicate decorative arts. And for 6 days, if everything went according to plan, you got to live inside that contradiction, to experience luxury on a scale that most people could never imagine, all while crossing an ocean that, despite what the ship's design seemed to suggest, was ultimately indifferent to human pretensions of mastery. Now that we've established the impressive public spaces and general magnificence of Titanic's first-class areas, let's talk about something that White Star Line probably didn't advertise quite as heavily: the fact that not all first-class tickets were created equal. Because here's the thing about first class on Titanic, it wasn't actually a single unified experience but rather a carefully stratified hierarchy of accommodations that ranged from quite nice to, are you kidding me with this level of luxury? You could book a first class ticket for about £30, which would get you a small inside cabin with shared bathroom facilities, or you could book a first class suite for £870, which would get you an apartment-sized space with a private promenade deck and probably a partridge in a pear tree if you asked nicely. Both were technically first class, but they were about as similar as a studio apartment and a penthouse suite are both technically residential real estate. This stratification wasn't accidental or haphazard. It was carefully designed to extract maximum revenue from passengers with varying levels of wealth, while maintaining the fiction that everyone in first class was part of the same elevated social world. It was brilliant marketing, really, allowing White Star Line to sell the prestige of first-class travel to passengers who couldn't quite afford the most expensive accommodations, while still providing genuinely palatial spaces for the ultra-wealthy passengers who expected nothing less than perfection. Everyone got to say they'd travelled first class on Titanic, but the actual experiences could vary dramatically depending on which part of first class you'd booked. Let's start at the bottom of the first-class hierarchy, with the most modest accommodations that still technically counted as first class. These were the single-berth inside cabins, usually located on the lower decks of the first-class section, away from the more prestigious areas. Inside cabin means no porthole, no window, no natural light whatsoever. You were essentially sleeping in a nicely decorated box in the middle of the ship, which sounds claustrophobic because it absolutely was, though in fairness, the Edwardians were much more comfortable with the idea of sleeping in small, enclosed spaces than modern people who've grown accustomed to master bedroom suites with walk-in closets the size of medieval great halls. These modest first-class cabins typically measured around 100 square feet, which is approximately the size of a modern parking space, except instead of parking your car, you were parking yourself and all your belongings for 6 days. The cabin would contain a single bed, not a bunk but an actual bed with a metal or wooden frame, which was already a step up from second and third class. There would be a small wardrobe for hanging clothes, though nowhere near enough space for all those outfits we discussed earlier, which meant your steward would be storing most of your trunks elsewhere and bringing you clothes as needed. The cabin would have a small sofa or chair, maybe a little table and electric lighting, which again was still novel enough to be noteworthy. The walls would be panelled in wood, probably pine or oak depending on the cabin class, with some decorative moulding to distinguish it from the more utilitarian second-class cabins. The floor would have linoleum covering with perhaps a small rug, because carpet throughout was reserved for the more expensive cabins. There would be an electric heater to ward off the North Atlantic cold, and an electric fan for when the heating made things too warm, which gives you some sense of how precise temperature control in 1912 was. The bed would have proper linens, pillows, blankets, the kind of bedding you'd find in a decent hotel, not luxurious but certainly comfortable. These basic first-class cabins were often occupied by single travellers, professional people, clergy members, teachers, people who could afford first-class travel but weren't independently wealthy. They were also popular with elderly passengers who didn't need much space and just wanted the prestige and dining privileges of first class without paying for accommodations they wouldn't use much anyway, since they'd be spending most of their time in the public rooms. For these passengers, the cabin was basically just a place to sleep and store belongings, not a space to socialise or spend significant time in. The real value of their first-class ticket was access to the dining room, the lounges, the decks, the social world of first class, not the size of their cabin. Moving up the hierarchy, you had standard first-class cabins with 2 berths, suitable for couples or travelling companions. These were larger, maybe 150 to 200 square feet, roughly the size of a small hotel room today. They might have portholes if located on an outside wall, which provided natural light and ventilation, and generally made the space feel less like a cave. The furniture would be similar to the single cabins, but with 2 beds instead of 1, more wardrobe space, perhaps a small sitting area with a sofa and table. These cabins were comfortable without being spectacular, appropriate for the middle tier of first-class passengers, people who were wealthy enough to afford decent accommodations but not so wealthy that they needed or expected palatial spaces. Some of these standard cabins had private bathroom facilities, which was a significant step up in luxury and convenience. A private bathroom in 1912 meant you had your own toilet, sink and bathtub, all with running water, both hot and cold. This was genuinely impressive technology for the era. Most homes, even wealthy homes, had bathrooms that were added as afterthoughts to houses originally built without indoor plumbing. Having reliable hot water was still enough of a luxury that people noticed and appreciated it. So a first-class cabin with private bath was offering amenities that many passengers might not have had in their own homes, particularly if they were from rural areas or smaller cities where modern plumbing infrastructure was still being developed. The bathrooms themselves were small by modern standards, efficiently designed to fit the necessary fixtures into minimal space, which is basically all bathrooms on ships even today, because square footage on a vessel is expensive and limited. But they were finished nicely, with tile floors, porcelain fixtures, copper or brass fittings, mirrors, and adequate lighting. Some even had heated towel rails, which is the kind of detail that seems minor but actually represents a significant level of luxury when you think about it. The idea that you could have a warm towel waiting after your bath while floating in the middle of the ocean would have seemed almost magical to many people in 1912. Then you had the larger first-class staterooms, which were more like small apartments than simple cabins. These might consist of 2 rooms, a bedroom and a sitting room, providing space for both sleeping and socializing. The sitting room would have a sofa, chairs, a table, perhaps a desk for writing, and would be decorated more elaborately than the standard cabins with better quality wood paneling, more ornate moulding, nicer carpet, and generally just a higher level of finish. The bedroom would have a proper bed or sometimes 2 beds, substantial wardrobes, maybe a dressing table, and enough space to actually move around comfortably. These staterooms often had private bathrooms, sometimes quite nice ones with full-size bathtubs rather than the compact fixtures in smaller cabins. These larger staterooms were designed for wealthy families, for couples who expected to entertain visitors in their accommodation, for people who were accustomed to living in large houses with multiple rooms and wanted something similar at sea. They were expensive, significantly more than the basic first-class cabins, but they provided a level of space and comfort that made the voyage feel less like roughing it on a ship and more like staying in a luxury hotel that happened to be moving. The location of these staterooms was also better, typically on the higher decks where there was less engine noise and vibration, closer to the public rooms, with better access to the promenades and social areas. And then we get to the really absurd end of the spectrum, the special suites that represented the absolute peak of Titanic's accommodation options. These weren't just larger cabins, they were genuinely different creatures, designed for the ultra-wealthy passengers who wouldn't consider travelling any other way. The ship had several of these special suites, each decorated in a different historical style, because apparently wealthy Edwardians wanted their ship cabins to look like rooms from different centuries, which is either sophisticated or ridiculous depending on your perspective on interior design. The most famous and expensive were the 2-parlour suites on B deck, which featured private promenade decks. Let me explain what a big deal this was. A promenade deck is an outdoor walking area, a place where you can take the air, look at the ocean, stretch your legs. On Titanic, there were public promenade decks where any first-class passenger could walk, but these 2 suites had their own private sections of promenade deck, about 50 feet long, enclosed with windows and accessible only from the suite. This meant you could step out of your sitting room onto your own private deck and enjoy the ocean views without encountering any other passengers. It was the 1912 equivalent of having a private terrace in a Manhattan penthouse, except floating and moving at 23 knots. These parlour suites consisted of multiple rooms, a large sitting room with elegant furniture, decorative plasterwork on the ceiling, expensive carpet, artwork on the walls, and generally the kind of elaborate decoration you'd find in a wealthy person's drawing room at home. 2 bedrooms, because obviously you needed a master bedroom and a guest bedroom, or perhaps a bedroom for your travelling companion. 2 wardrobe rooms, entire rooms just for storing clothes, which given the packing requirements we discussed earlier was actually necessary rather than excessive. A private bathroom with full facilities, and that private promenade deck which alone probably justified the astronomical ticket price for people who valued privacy and exclusivity above almost anything else. The decoration in these suites was extraordinary. One was done in Italian Renaissance style with ornate plasterwork, heavy furniture, rich fabrics, and probably enough gilt to make a Medici feel at home. The other was decorated in a different period style, equally elaborate but with its own aesthetic. The furniture was custom-made for the ship, substantial pieces that wouldn't look out of place in a mansion. The bathrooms had the best fixtures available, the finest tile, multiple mirrors, and all the amenities a wealthy person could want. The bedrooms had real beds, not ship bunks, with quality mattresses and linens that were probably thread counts most people had never heard of. These suites, in today's money, we're talking roughly £100,000 or about $125,000 for a one-way ticket, for 6 days of travel. You could buy a house for that kind of money in 1912, not a mansion, but a perfectly respectable house. But for the passengers who booked these suites, that cost was worth it for the privacy, the space, the prestige, and the simple fact that they could afford it when almost nobody else could. On Titanic's maiden voyage, one of these parlour suites was occupied by J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of White Star Line, which made sense because he essentially owned the ship and probably wasn't going to book himself into a basic inside cabin. The other was occupied by Charlotte Cardeza and her son, who were American millionaires with the kind of money that made paying £870 for a ship cabin seem reasonable. Mrs. Cardeza reportedly travelled with 14 trunks and 3 crates of luggage, plus a personal servant, because apparently the 4 trunks that normal wealthy people brought were far too limiting for someone of her status. Her wardrobe for the voyage was rumoured to include 70 dresses, which is approximately 11 dresses per day if she actually wore them all, suggesting that either she changed clothes very frequently or she just really liked having options. Beyond the parlour suites, there were other special accommodations that fell somewhere between standard staterooms and the most elaborate suites. The ship had several deluxe staterooms that featured sitting rooms, bedrooms, and private bathrooms, but without the private promenade decks. They were often located on B and C decks, the more prestigious locations, with good access to public rooms and, if positioned correctly, nice views from their portholes or windows. There were also some 2-room suites done in various decorative styles. An Empire-style suite with furniture and decoration inspired by early 19th century French design. A Regency-style suite channeling early 19th century British aesthetics. A Louis XVI suite with late 18th century French decoration. A Georgian suite with 18th century British design elements. Walking through the first-class cabin areas must have been like taking a tour through European decorative arts history, assuming you could access all these spaces, which of course you couldn't because they were private accommodations. But the variety of styles shows how White Star Line was trying to appeal to different tastes and preferences, offering passengers the chance to sleep in whatever historical period they fancied. The location of your cabin within the first-class section also mattered quite a bit for your overall experience. The most desirable cabins were on the higher decks, B and C decks particularly, because these were closest to the public rooms, had the least engine noise and vibration, and generally provided the smoothest ride. The lower you went in the ship, the more you felt the engines, the more you noticed the vibration of the propellers, the more the motion of the sea affected your accommodation. This wasn't a huge issue on a ship as large and stable as Titanic, but it was noticeable enough that passengers with a choice preferred the higher decks. Being midship was also preferable to being at the bow or stern. The middle of the ship experiences the least motion in rough seas, while the ends pitch and roll more noticeably. Most of the first-class accommodations were located midship for exactly this reason, with the most expensive suites and staterooms clustered in the most stable, comfortable part of the vessel. The basic first-class cabins might be located further forward or aft, where the ride was slightly less smooth but still much better than what second- and third-class passengers experienced in their more extreme locations. Now let's talk about what happened to all that luggage we spent so much time packing. Because remember, first-class passengers were arriving with multiple steamer trunks, hat boxes, cases of various kinds, and possibly a partridge in a pear tree if they were particularly ambitious packers. All of this had to be stored somewhere, and unless you'd booked one of the suites with its own wardrobe rooms, your cabin probably didn't have space for 4 enormous trunks, plus all your other belongings. This is where the steward service became crucial. Your steward, the crew member assigned to your cabin and the cabins around yours, was responsible for managing your luggage situation. When you boarded, you'd tell the steward which items you needed in your cabin for immediate use, and he would arrange to have those unpacked and organised. Your clothes would be hung in the wardrobe, your toiletries arranged in the bathroom, your personal items placed where you wanted them. Everything else, the trunks you didn't need immediate access to, would be stored in the baggage room, a dedicated storage area where passengers' excess luggage was kept for the voyage. If you needed something from your stored trunks, you'd simply tell your steward, and he would retrieve it for you. Need a different evening gown for tonight's dinner? The steward would fetch it from your trunk in storage and bring it to your cabin. Want to switch out your day clothes because you've worn everything currently in your wardrobe? The steward would make that happen. This system allowed even passengers in smaller cabins to travel with extensive wardrobes because they didn't need to keep everything in their accommodation at once. It was like having a personal warehouse with delivery service, which is actually quite sophisticated logistics when you think about the coordination required to track hundreds of passengers' possessions across multiple storage locations. The steward service was included in your first-class ticket price, though passengers were expected to tip their stewards at the end of the voyage, and these tips could be substantial for stewards who provided exceptional service. A good steward could make quite a bit in tips over a season of crossings, especially if they managed to get assigned to the wealthier passengers who tipped generously. The stewards were responsible for keeping your cabin clean, making your bed, tidying up, ensuring you had fresh towels and linens, and basically anticipating your needs before you even articulated them. It was the kind of attentive personal service that wealthy passengers expected and that White Star Line promised as part of the first-class experience. Your steward would also wake you in the morning if you requested it, which many passengers did since there were no alarm clocks in the cabins, and nobody wanted to miss breakfast after paying first-class prices. He would bring you tea or coffee in your cabin if you wanted it, though most passengers went to the dining room for meals. He would press your clothes if they got wrinkled, shine your shoes, and generally perform all the small maintenance tasks that kept your wardrobe looking proper throughout the voyage. For wealthy passengers who had servants at home, this level of service was familiar and expected. For passengers who were less accustomed to having personal servants, it could be a bit awkward at first, though most people apparently adjusted quickly to having someone else manage the mundane details of their daily life. The ratio of stewards to passengers was quite good in first class, probably one steward for every 5 to 10 passengers depending on the section. This meant that stewards could actually provide personalised attention rather than just going through the motions. They learned your preferences, your schedule, your habits. They knew when you typically retired for the evening, when you liked to wake up, how you preferred your cabin arranged. Good stewards became almost invisible, managing everything so efficiently that passengers barely noticed the work being done, which is the hallmark of excellent service in any era. For passengers in the suites, the service was even more elaborate. Some wealthy passengers brought their own personal servants, valets or ladies' maids who were there solely to attend to their employers' needs. These personal servants would have their own accommodations, usually in second class since even the most generous employer wasn't going to book first-class cabins for servants, and they would come to their employer's suite to help with dressing, hair, and the countless other tasks that wealthy Edwardians apparently couldn't perform themselves. Mrs. Cardizza's personal maid would have been responsible for managing that wardrobe of 70 dresses, ensuring everything was pressed and ready, helping Mrs. Cardessa change outfits multiple times per day, and generally performing all the labour-intensive work required to maintain an Edwardian woman's appearance. The contrast between the most and least expensive first-class accommodations was substantial enough that passengers must have been quite aware of the hierarchy. If you were in a basic inside cabin, you knew that other first-class passengers were living in suites with private promenades. If you were sharing bathroom facilities with several other cabins, you knew that some passengers had their own private bathrooms with heated towel rails. This created a complex social dynamic within first class, where everyone was supposedly part of the same elevated social world, but with clear gradations of wealth and status visible in something as basic as where you slept. The public rooms somewhat equalized this hierarchy. Once you left your cabin and entered the dining saloon or the lounge or the smoking room, you were in shared spaces where the passenger in the basic cabin had the same access as the passenger in the parlour suite. You could sit in the same lounges, walk the same promenades, eat in the same dining room. The quality of food and service was the same regardless of your cabin class. This democratic aspect of the public spaces was part of what made first-class travel appealing to passengers who couldn't afford the most expensive accommodations. You got access to all the luxury and prestige of first class, even if your private space was modest. But there were still ways that the hierarchy manifested in public. The passengers in the suites were often the most prominent, the ones everyone else knew by reputation or recognized from newspapers. They tended to dine at the best tables in the dining room, the tables closest to the captain's table, or in the most prestigious locations. They were invited to dine with the ship's officers, which was a social honour that wasn't extended to every first-class passenger. They hosted small gatherings in their suites, private social events that only certain passengers would be invited to attend. So while everyone in first class had access to the same public rooms, the actual social dynamic still reflected the wealth differences indicated by cabin accommodations. The passengers themselves were quite varied in background and circumstances, which made first class a fascinating social microcosm. You had old money American families like the Astors, whose wealth went back generations and who carried themselves with the quiet confidence of people who'd never had to think about money. You had new money Americans, industrialists and entrepreneurs who'd made fortunes in railroads or mining or manufacturing and were still proving they belonged among the social elite. You had British aristocrats travelling first class on family money and inherited status, though some British aristocrats were actually less wealthy than the American millionaires and were basically living on prestige and inherited estates that required expensive upkeep. You had professional people travelling first class because their work allowed them to afford it, even though they weren't independently wealthy. Academics, clergy members, successful doctors or lawyers, people who'd earned enough to travel comfortably but who were never going to book a parlour suite. You had elderly couples taking perhaps their last trip abroad, spending money they'd saved over years of work. You had young couples on honeymoons, splurging on first-class travel as part of their wedding celebration. You had single women travelling, which was still somewhat unusual in 1912 but becoming more accepted, particularly for widows or older unmarried women with independent means. This variety meant that first class wasn't a monolithic social world, but rather a collection of different social circles that intersected in the public spaces. The ultra-wealthy had their own social world, dining together, gathering in each other's suites, largely ignoring the less wealthy first-class passengers, except when social niceties required acknowledgement. The middle tier of first-class passengers had their own social networks, people of similar background and means who gravitated toward each other. The less wealthy first-class passengers, those in the basic cabins, probably spent more time in public rooms because their accommodations weren't comfortable enough for extended socializing, and they formed their own connections with other passengers in similar circumstances. The ship's officers and staff navigated these social hierarchies carefully. They knew who the most important passengers were, the ones who could make or break White Star Line's reputation, with a word in the right social circles. They knew which passengers expected special attention and which were content with standard service. The captain would invite the most prominent passengers to dine at his table, a social honour that was highly valued. The chief steward would ensure that the needs of wealthy passengers were met promptly and perfectly. But at the same time, the staff maintained professional courtesy with all first-class passengers, because even those in basic cabins had paid substantial sums for their tickets and deserved good service. The result was a social environment that was simultaneously egalitarian and hierarchical, democratic and class-conscious, open and exclusive. Everyone in first class had access to the same spaces and amenities, but not everyone had the same experience of those spaces and amenities. Your cabin class influenced where you were in the social pecking order, but it didn't completely determine your social experience. A charming passenger in a basic cabin could become popular and sought after, while a wealthy passenger in a suite could be socially awkward and largely ignored. Money mattered enormously in first class, but personality and social skills still had their own currency. This complicated social world existed in a very small space, really. The first-class section of Titanic, while elaborate and luxurious, only took up a portion of the ship. Several hundred passengers were living in close proximity, seeing each other multiple times per day in dining rooms and lounges and on promenades, creating a temporary community that would only exist for the 6 days of the voyage. Everyone aboard knew they were part of something special, travelling on this magnificent ship's maiden voyage, but they experienced that specialness quite differently, depending on whether they'd paid £30 or £870 for the privilege. The cabin system on Titanic represented a masterful exercise in market segmentation, offering different products at different price points to extract maximum revenue from passengers with varying levels of wealth, while maintaining the overall prestige of first-class travel. It was capitalism at its finest, or most cynical, depending on your perspective. White Star Line managed to sell the dream of first-class luxury to passengers across a wide range of financial circumstances, from those who could barely afford it to those who could afford anything and simply wanted the best. And everyone aboard, regardless of their cabin class, could say they'd travelled first class on Titanic, which in April 1912 was about as prestigious a claim as you could make in the world of transatlantic travel. The social hierarchy of the cabin system also reflected broader Edwardian attitudes about class and status. The idea that wealth should be visible, that social status should be legible in your surroundings, was fundamental to how these people understood the world. You weren't just wealthy, you demonstrated your wealth through your possessions, your accommodations, your lifestyle. And first class on Titanic provided an environment where that demonstration could take place on a grand scale, where the differences between comfortable wealth and spectacular wealth were made visible in the difference between a nice stateroom and a suite with a private promenade deck. It was a world where everyone knew exactly where they stood in the hierarchy, where status was constantly being performed and observed and evaluated, where the cabin you'd booked said something important about who you were and how you fit into the social order. But here's what makes it all a bit poignant in retrospect. None of that hierarchy, none of those careful social distinctions, none of the difference between a £30 ticket and an £870 ticket would matter at all in a few days when the ship hit an iceberg and started to sink. The ocean is a great equalizer, spectacularly indifferent to human social hierarchies. Your chances of survival would depend on factors like which deck you were on when the ship struck, how quickly you reacted, whether you made it into a lifeboat, not on how much you'd paid for your ticket or how nice your cabin was. Some passengers in modest accommodation survived. Some passengers in the most expensive suites did not. The ship that seemed to represent humanity's triumph over nature, that seemed to prove that money and technology could overcome any obstacle, was about to demonstrate quite definitively that nature always gets the last word. But for now, for these few days of the voyage before everything went wrong, the cabin system and its careful social hierarchies represented what first class was all about, creating a floating world where wealth could buy not just comfort, but genuine magnificence, where status was visible in every detail, and where, for a ticket price ranging from substantial to absolutely astronomical, you could live inside that world and feel like you were part of something extraordinary. If you thought the elaborate dress codes and social rituals of first class were excessive, wait until you hear about the food situation. Because eating on Titanic wasn't just about sustenance or even pleasure, it was basically a full-time occupation that structured your entire day around the consumption of truly staggering quantities of elaborate cuisine. Modern people who skip breakfast and grab a sad desk lunch would have been viewed with genuine concern by first-class passengers in 1912, who approached meals with the kind of dedication and commitment that most of us reserve for things like careers or raising children. The daily eating schedule on Titanic was essentially a marathon of consumption that would make modern competitive eaters look like casual snackers. Let's start with the basic mathematics of feeding first-class passengers for a 6-day voyage. The ship's provisions included approximately 75,000 pounds of fresh meat, which is roughly equivalent to 15 full-grown cows, or about 375 pounds of meat per day, though obviously not all of that was for first class alone. There were 40,000 fresh eggs aboard, which works out to nearly 7,000 eggs per day for all passengers and crew, though again first class consumed a disproportionate share. There were 7,000 heads of lettuce, 40 tons of potatoes, 2,500 pounds of coffee and 800 bundles of asparagus. The ship carried 1,000 bottles of wine and another 850 bottles of spirits, not counting the beer and ale and champagne and all the other alcoholic beverages available. There were 1,750 quarts of ice cream aboard, which seems like a lot until you realise that first-class passengers could order ice cream basically whenever they wanted it. The provisions list went on for pages, covering everything from exotic fruits that had to be sourced from specialised suppliers to common staples that were needed in massive quantities. This wasn't ship food in the modern sense of mediocre airline meals or cafeteria-style buffets. This was fine dining, restaurant-quality cuisine prepared by French chefs and their staffs, using ingredients that would have been at home in the best restaurants of Paris or London. White Star Line had essentially built floating restaurants into their ships, complete kitchens with all the equipment and staff necessary to produce elaborate multi-course meals multiple times per day for hundreds of demanding passengers who knew good food and expected nothing less than excellence. The kitchen operation was located on the lower decks, a massive facility filled with ranges and ovens and preparation areas and cold storage and all the infrastructure required for large-scale cooking. The head chef was French, because in 1912 French cuisine was considered the pinnacle of culinary achievement, and no self-respecting luxury liner would hire anyone else to oversee their first-class kitchen. Under him was a staff of assistant chefs, sous chefs, pastry chefs, butchers, bakers, and numerous other specialists, each responsible for their particular domain. The kitchen brigade system, still used in professional kitchens today, was in full effect on Titanic, with a clear hierarchy and division of labour that allowed this team to produce hundreds of complex dishes simultaneously while maintaining quality and consistency. The daily eating schedule began with breakfast, served in the first-class dining saloon from 8 to 10:30 a.m., which is actually quite civilised compared to the crack-of-dawn breakfast hours on some modern cruises. But here's where it gets interesting. Breakfast on Titanic wasn't a continental breakfast of pastries and coffee. It wasn't even a standard American breakfast of eggs and bacon. The breakfast menu offered choices that would make a modern brunch spot seem limited. You could have fresh fruit, including exotic fruits like oranges and grapes that were expensive and hard to find in April. You could have porridge or oatmeal served with cream and sugar. You could have eggs prepared any way you wanted them, boiled, poached, scrambled, fried, shirred, or as an omelette with your choice of fillings. There was bacon, ham, sausages, liver, kidneys if you were into that sort of thing, which apparently wealthy Edwardians were. There were fresh rolls, toast, croissants, pastries, marmalade, jam, honey. There was smoked fish, including kippers and fin and haddie. You could have grilled mutton chops or beefsteak if you wanted a substantial breakfast that most modern people would consider more appropriate for dinner. The breakfast service alone would have required enormous coordination. Imagine cooking eggs to order for several hundred people, ensuring everything arrives hot at the table, managing all the different preferences and special requests, while working in a kitchen that's moving through the ocean. The waitstaff had to navigate through the dining room carrying heavy trays of hot food, coordinating with the kitchen to ensure proper timing, all while maintaining the gracious service that first-class passengers expected. And this was just the first meal of the day, the warm-up act before the real eating began. Mid-morning you could have bouillon or consommé, which was basically fancy broth served in cups on deck for passengers who were taking the air and needed a little something to sustain them between breakfast and lunch. Because apparently 3 hours between meals was too long to go without some form of nourishment. This wasn't a formal meal, more of a snack service, but it was available and many passengers took advantage of it, particularly on cold days when a hot drink was welcome. Lunch was served from 1 to 2:30 p.m, and this wasn't a light lunch either. We're talking a full multi-course meal that could easily include soup, fish, a main meat course, vegetables, salad, dessert, and cheese with fruit. The lunch menu changed daily and offered multiple choices for each course. You might have consommé or cream soup to start, then perhaps grilled sole or salmon with sauce, then roast chicken or lamb chops or beef tenderloin for your main course, accompanied by several vegetables and potatoes prepared in whatever style the kitchen offered that day. Then maybe a dessert like pudding or pastry or ice cream, then cheese and fruit to finish. The whole meal could easily last an hour or more, particularly if you were lingering over coffee and conversation with your table mates. The lunch menu was substantial but slightly less formal than dinner, allowing for dishes that were elegant but not necessarily requiring the elaborate preparation of evening meals. Still, the quality and variety were impressive. Fresh fish had to be kept properly chilled before cooking, which was a genuine technical challenge in 1912 when refrigeration was still relatively new technology. The meat had to be properly butchered and aged. The vegetables had to be fresh and properly prepared. The sauces, and there were many sauces in French cuisine, had to be made from scratch using proper technique. Every element of every dish required skill and attention, multiplied by hundreds of servings. Then came afternoon tea, served around 4 p.m, because Edwardians were apparently incapable of going more than a few hours without eating something. Afternoon tea wasn't just a cup of tea, it was an entire social ritual that required its own dedicated space, the veranda café, where passengers could gather for what was ostensibly a light refreshment, but was actually another substantial intake of calories. There would be multiple types of tea available, served properly in china cups with saucers. There would be finger sandwiches with various fillings, cucumber, which was considered very refined, egg salad, salmon, chicken, watercress, all with the crust cut off because apparently the edges of bread were too pedestrian for first class. There would be scones with clotted cream and jam, which alone could constitute a reasonable snack for a normal person. There would be pastries and small cakes, elaborate confections made by the ship's pastry chefs. And there would be conversation and socializing, because afternoon tea was as much about being seen and seeing others as it was about the actual consumption of tea and pastries. The afternoon tea service was particularly popular with women, who would gather in their tea dresses, which were an entire category of clothing specifically designed for this one daily activity, to chat and gossip and generally engage in the social rituals that were so important to maintaining one's position in first-class society. Men might join for tea as well, though they were more likely to skip it in favour of spending time in the smoking room or on deck. But for many passengers, afternoon tea was a highlight of the day, a chance to relax in a beautiful setting with good company and excellent refreshments after the more formal atmosphere of lunch. And then we get to dinner, the crown jewel of the daily eating schedule, the meal that everything else built toward, the culinary performance that justified those elaborate evening gowns and white tie tailcoats. Dinner was served at 7:30 p.m. and was a formal ritualized affair that could easily last 2 hours or more. The menu consisted of up to 11 courses, though not every passenger ate all 11 courses because that would require the digestive capacity of a small army. But the courses were offered, and you could have as much or as little as you wanted, selecting from multiple options within each course. Let me walk you through what an 11-course dinner actually meant, because the modern idea of multiple courses usually maxes out at maybe 3 or 4. First course was hors d'oeuvres, small appetizers meant to stimulate the appetite, things like oysters or canapés or other delicate bites. Second course was soup, and not just one soup, but often a choice between clear soup like consommé and thick soup like cream of something. Third course was fish, typically a light fish preparation with sauce served with appropriate accompaniments. Fourth course might be an entree, which in French culinary terms doesn't mean main course, but rather a smaller meat or savoury dish that comes before the main course. Fifth course was the joint, which was British terminology for a large roasted meat like beef or lamb, carved at the table or in the kitchen and served with gravy and vegetables. Sixth course was poultry or game, because apparently having already eaten fish and multiple meat courses, you definitely needed some duck or chicken or perhaps quail. Seventh course was a cold dish, often some kind of pâté or aspic, which modern people would find baffling but Edwardians apparently enjoyed. Eighth course was salad, served late in the meal in the French style rather than before the main course as Americans typically do now. Ninth course was dessert, and not just one dessert, but often a choice between multiple elaborate sweets like puddings, pastries, ice cream, or elaborate moulded confections. 10th course was cheese and fruit, because even after 9 previous courses you might want some cheese. And 11th course was coffee or tea, served with petit fours and other small sweets, because clearly you hadn't consumed enough sugar yet. Now in practice, most passengers didn't eat literally all 11 courses. You might skip the hors d'oeuvres or have only soup and not fish, or skip the cold course and go straight to salad. But the point was that these options were available, that the kitchen was prepared to serve all these courses to anyone who wanted them, that first-class dining was about abundance and choice, and the demonstration of wealth through sheer culinary excess. The menus changed every night, offering different options, ensuring that passengers wouldn't get bored eating the same things repeatedly during the 6-day voyage. The actual dishes offered were quite sophisticated by any standard. The famous last dinner served on Titanic, on the evening of April 14th, 1912, included items like oysters, consommé Olga, cream of barley soup, poached salmon with mousseline sauce, filet mignon with sauté foie gras and truffle, lamb with mint sauce, roast duckling with applesauce, punch romaine, which was a palate-cleansing frozen cocktail served between courses, roast squab with watercress, cold asparagus salad, pâté de foie gras, and multiple dessert options including Waldorf pudding, peaches in chartreuse jelly, chocolate and vanilla eclairs, and French ice cream. This wasn't simple home cooking or even standard restaurant fare. This was haute cuisine, elaborate dishes that required genuine skill to prepare and present. The wine service was equally elaborate. First-class passengers had access to an extensive wine list that included fine French wines, champagnes, ports, sherries, and other sophisticated beverages. Different wines were appropriate for different courses, and knowledgeable diners would select wines to complement each dish. White wines with fish and poultry, red wines with beef and lamb, sweet wines with dessert, port with cheese. The wine stewards were trained to help passengers make appropriate selections and to serve each wine properly at the correct temperature in the correct glassware. The wine service alone was a performance, with bottles being opened tableside, wines being poured with flourish, empty glasses being whisked away and replaced as you moved from course to course. For passengers who preferred spirits, there were extensive offerings of whiskey, brandy, gin, and other liquors, available either with dinner or afterward in the smoking room, where men would gather to drink and smoke cigars while digesting their enormous meals. The bar in the smoking room was well stocked with premium brands, and passengers could order essentially anything they wanted. Some passengers probably spent a fair portion of the voyage in a pleasant state of mild inebriation, given the amount of alcohol available, and the general Edwardian attitude that drinking was a normal part of social life, rather than something to be done in moderation. The dining room service was choreographed like a ballet. Waiters moved through the room in coordinated patterns, delivering courses simultaneously to tables across the dining saloon, ensuring that everyone received their food at approximately the same time and at the proper temperature. The timing had to be perfect because you can't have some tables finishing their fish course, while others are still waiting for theirs to arrive. The waiters had to remember who ordered what, accommodate special requests and dietary restrictions, and maintain gracious professional demeanour throughout the service, even when dealing with demanding passengers who were used to having servants cater to their every whim. The table settings were elaborate productions in themselves. Each place setting included multiple pieces of silverware arranged in the proper order for the courses that would be served. Different forks for different courses, multiple knives, soup spoons, dessert spoons, all in proper position so diners would know which implement to use when. There were multiple glasses for different beverages, water goblets, wine glasses of various sizes and shapes depending on what wines were being served. The china was fine porcelain with the white Star Line logo, expensive stuff that would be a collector's item today. The linens were crisp white damask changed for every meal. Fresh flowers adorned every table, elaborate centerpieces that had to be carefully maintained throughout the voyage. The whole presentation was designed to be impressive, to remind passengers that they were dining in one of the finest restaurants on Earth, even though that restaurant happened to be floating in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The formal dinner atmosphere was quite rigid by modern standards. You were expected to arrive properly dressed in full evening wear, which we've already discussed at length. You were expected to demonstrate proper table manners, using the correct utensils in the correct order, not making any social faux pas that would mark you as someone unfamiliar with refined dining. Conversation was expected to be pleasant and appropriate, nothing too serious or controversial that might spoil the mood. Women and men often separated after dinner, with women gathering in the reception room or lounge and men retiring to the smoking room, a gender segregation that seems bizarre now, but was standard practice in 1912 upper-class society. But not all meals on Titanic were formal affairs. The ship also offered more casual dining options for passengers who wanted something lighter or less structured than the full dining saloon experience. The Café Parisien, which we mentioned earlier, served à la carte meals in a more relaxed atmosphere. You could order specific dishes rather than working through a multi-course menu, you could dine at less traditional hours, and the overall vibe was more casual, though casual in this context still meant you needed to be properly dressed and well-behaved. The cafe was particularly popular with younger passengers who found the main dining saloon too formal and stuffy. The Veranda Cafe offered light meals and refreshments throughout the day. You could get sandwiches, salads, simple dishes that didn't require the elaborate preparation of dining saloon meals. This was convenient for passengers who wanted to eat something but didn't want to commit to a full multi-course meal, or who wanted to dine at odd hours outside the formal meal times. The Veranda Cafe's more flexible schedule and lighter menu made it a popular spot for passengers who spent a lot of time on deck and wanted to grab something to eat without going through the whole production of a formal meal. Room service was also available for passengers who wanted to dine in their cabins, particularly useful for those in the larger suites who had enough space to accommodate a proper meal service. You could order from a special room service menu, and stewards would deliver your meal on trays with all the necessary silverware, china, and presentation. Some passengers took advantage of this for breakfast, enjoying the luxury of having their morning meal served in bed or in their sitting room without having to dress and go to the dining saloon. Others might order room service if they were feeling unwell or simply wanted privacy. The contrast between formal and informal dining was quite pronounced. The formal dinners in the main dining saloon were performances, social rituals where appearance and proper behaviour mattered as much as the food itself. Everyone was on display, everyone was being observed and evaluated, and the meal was as much about demonstrating your refinement and social standing as it was about eating. The informal options like the cafes and room service allowed passengers to relax somewhat, to eat without the pressure of constant social observation, though you were still expected to maintain basic standards of dress and behaviour appropriate to first class. The sheer quantity of food consumed daily by first-class passengers is staggering when you think about it. Even if you didn't eat all 11 courses at dinner, you were probably consuming at least 4 substantial meals per day plus snacks and refreshments. The caloric intake must have been enormous, probably 3,000 to 4,000 calories per day or more for passengers who took full advantage of all the dining options. This was normal for wealthy people in 1912, when physical activity was limited for the upper classes, and large meals were seen as a sign of prosperity and success. The ideal body type for men was substantial, suggesting good living and prosperity. For women, the ideal was a fuller figure than modern beauty standards prefer, achieved through the combination of corsets that redistributed body mass and the substantial eating that was expected of the wealthy. The kitchen staff working to produce all this food were essentially invisible to the passengers, labouring in hot, cramped conditions below decks, while the first-class passengers enjoyed the fruits of their labour in the elegant dining saloon. The contrast between the working conditions in the kitchen and the luxurious dining experience upstairs was stark. Kitchen staff worked long hours in high heat, managing dangerous equipment, coordinating complex preparations under time pressure, all while the ship was moving through the ocean. It was demanding, skilled work that received none of the glory or appreciation that goes to chefs in modern restaurant culture, where culinary professionals are celebrated as artists and craftspeople. The food waste must have been substantial as well. When you're serving 11-course meals to hundreds of people, many of whom won't finish everything on their plates, you end up with a lot of leftover food. Some of it could be repurposed for crew meals or for less formal dining services, but much of it probably ended up being thrown overboard, feeding the fish of the North Atlantic with the remnants of haute cuisine. The economics of the operation probably didn't care much about waste, since the point was to provide abundance and excess to justify the premium ticket prices, not to run an efficient operation that minimized food waste. The wine cellars and liquor storage areas were substantial, requiring proper temperature control and organization to keep hundreds of bottles of wine and spirits in good condition throughout the voyage. The wine stewards had to track inventory, ensure proper storage, select appropriate bottles for service, and manage the logistics of getting the right wines to the right tables at the right times. It was the refrigeration technology in 1912 was adequate but not as reliable as modern systems. Fresh meat and fish had to be carefully monitored to ensure they stayed fresh throughout the voyage. Vegetables and fruits had to be stored properly to prevent spoilage. Dairy products like milk and cream required constant refrigeration. The ship had substantial cold storage facilities, but managing perishable inventory for hundreds of passengers over nearly a week required careful planning and constant attention. Some items were expected to be consumed earlier in the voyage when they were freshest. The most delicate fish would be served in the first few days. Fresh vegetables that didn't store well would be used early. More staple items like root vegetables and preserved foods would be saved for later in the voyage. The menus were planned to accommodate this natural progression, ensuring that passengers were still getting excellent food even on day 5 or 6, when some of the initial provisions had been exhausted. The dining experience on Titanic represented the peak of Edwardian luxury dining, combining French culinary excellence with British service traditions and American abundance. It was excess as both art form and lifestyle, the idea that more is always better when it comes to food and drink, that variety and choice are themselves forms of luxury, that the ability to consume this much high-quality food is a sign of success and sophistication. Modern dining tends towards smaller portions and more restrained presentations, at least in fine dining contexts. But Edwardian first-class dining was unabashedly about abundance, about having more options than you could possibly consume, about demonstrating wealth through sheer excess. For passengers on the voyage, the dining experience was probably one of the highlights of first-class travel. The food was genuinely excellent, prepared by skilled chefs using quality ingredients. The service was attentive and professional. The atmosphere in the dining saloon was elegant and refined. Even passengers who were accustomed to fine dining in their normal lives probably found the Titanic dining experience impressive, and for passengers who were less experienced with haute cuisine, it must have been genuinely exciting to participate in these elaborate meals. The last dinner served on Titanic on the evening of April 14, 1912, was apparently a particularly festive affair. Passengers were enjoying themselves, the voyage had been smooth and pleasant so far, the ship had been performing beautifully, and there was a general atmosphere of satisfaction and celebration. The dining saloon was full of well-dressed passengers enjoying elaborate food and good wine, conversation and laughter filling the room, everyone participating in this daily ritual that was so central to first-class life. Nobody knew that within a few hours the ship would strike an iceberg and begin to sink, that this festive dinner would be the last meal many of these people would ever eat, that this elegant dining saloon would soon be tilted at an angle as the ship went down. But for those hours during dinner, everything was fine, everything was luxurious, everything was exactly as it should be in the floating palace that was Titanic. The tragedy that followed makes it impossible to discuss the dining experience on Titanic without feeling some sadness about the contrast between the luxury and abundance of those meals and the disaster that was coming. But the dining experience itself, considered separately from what came after, represented a genuine achievement in hospitality and culinary arts. Creating restaurant-quality food for hundreds of people on a moving ship, maintaining high standards of service and presentation, managing complex logistics to ensure everything worked smoothly. This was genuinely impressive work that deserves recognition, even as we acknowledge that all the luxury and excess couldn't prevent the ultimate failure of the ship's design and operation. The gastronomic marathon of first-class dining on Titanic was both wonderful and absurd, impressive and excessive, a testament to human creativity and skill, and also to human capacity for overconsumption and waste. It represented the best and worst of Edwardian luxury culture. The genuine appreciation for quality and craftsmanship, combined with the mindless excess that came from having too much money and too much faith in the idea that wealth could solve any problem or fulfill any desire. For 6 days, or rather for 4 days before everything went wrong, first-class passengers on Titanic got to experience dining on a scale that most people could never imagine, eating food that kings and queens would have envied, all while floating across the Atlantic in the most magnificent ship ever built. It was extraordinary. It was excessive. It was, like so much else about first class on Titanic, a moment in time that would never be quite repeated again, a peak of a certain kind of luxury that the First World War and the social changes that followed would sweep away forever. After spending several hours working your way through an 11-course dinner, and then perhaps smoking cigars and drinking brandy in the smoking room until midnight, you might think first-class passengers would be ready to retire to their cabins and sleep off the caloric excess. But no, because Titanic offered something that most luxury liners of the era didn't have, something that seems completely normal to modern cruise ship passengers, but was genuinely revolutionary in 1912, recreational facilities. The ship wasn't just a method of getting from Southampton to New York while eating elaborate meals and wearing uncomfortable formal wear, it was also, bizarrely enough, a fitness centre, with equipment that sounds like it was designed by someone having a fever dream about the future of exercise. Let's start with the swimming pool, because this is perhaps the most impressive of Titanic's athletic amenities, and also the most appreciated by modern people, who can't imagine why anyone would need electric camels in a gymnasium. The swimming pool, or swimming bath as it was called at the time, was located on F-deck in the forward part of the ship, and it was the first heated swimming pool on any ocean liner. Let me repeat that: heated. Swimming pool on a ship in 1912. This was technology bordering on sorcery as far as most people were concerned. The pool was filled with seawater, not fresh water, because fresh water was too precious to use for something as frivolous as swimming when it was needed for drinking and bathing and the various other necessities of life aboard a ship. But this seawater was heated, using the ship's steam heating system, to a comfortable temperature that wouldn't cause hypothermia when you jumped in. The pool itself measured about 30 feet long by 14 feet wide, which is not Olympic size by any stretch, but was certainly adequate for swimming laps or just splashing around. The depth ranged from about 4 feet at the shallow end to 7 feet at the deep end, deep enough to actually swim rather than just wade. The room housing the pool was tiled in white with blue accents, creating a clean, bright environment that looked appropriately aquatic. There were changing rooms adjacent to the pool, separate facilities for men and women because heaven forbid anyone see someone of the opposite sex in swimming attire, which in 1912 covered more of the body than most modern business casual outfits, but was still considered somewhat scandalous. The swimming costumes of the era were elaborate affairs that seemed designed more to prevent swimming than to facilitate it. Men's swimming costumes were one-piece outfits that covered from neck to knees, made of wool or cotton that would become heavy and clingy when wet. Women's swimming costumes were even more comprehensive, full-body outfits with skirts and bloomers and enough fabric to make a modest day dress, all of which would absorb water and add significant weight when wet. The idea that you could just wear a simple swimsuit and actually swim efficiently was still decades away. But even in these restrictive garments, passengers could enjoy the novelty of swimming in a heated pool while crossing the Atlantic Ocean, which was genuinely remarkable. The pool was open at different hours for men and women, because mixed swimming was not considered appropriate in respectable society. Men had their designated hours when they could use the pool, and women had their separate hours, and never the twain shall meet, at least not in swimming costumes. This gender segregation was maintained throughout the ship's recreational facilities, reflecting the broader Edwardian attitude that men and women needed separate spaces for various activities. The pool also required advance booking because it could only accommodate a limited number of swimmers at once, and apparently first-class passengers needed to schedule even their recreational swimming, rather than just showing up and jumping in like some kind of anarchist. Using the pool cost extra, which is the kind of detail that seems petty now but made perfect sense in 1912 when every possible service was monetized. Your first-class ticket got you access to the dining room and the public lounges and the decks, but special facilities like the swimming pool, the Turkish baths and the gymnasium required additional fees. This was partly to cover the operational costs of maintaining these facilities, and partly because exclusivity was its own form of luxury. Making something available only to those willing to pay extra meant it would be less crowded and more prestigious, which appealed to wealthy passengers who already had regular access to private clubs and other exclusive venues. Adjacent to the swimming pool were the Turkish baths, which might be the single most absurd amenity on the ship in terms of sheer unnecessary luxury. These weren't just basic steam rooms, they were elaborate facilities decorated in Moorish style with tilework and carved details, and generally enough Orientalist fantasy to make a modern cultural sensitivity expert weep. The Turkish bath complex included several rooms with different temperatures and purposes. A temperate room where you could warm up gradually, a hot room with steam, a cooling room where you could recover afterward, and a shampooing room where attendants could wash your hair and presumably scrub you down, because Edwardian wealthy people apparently couldn't be trusted to bathe themselves properly. The decoration in the Turkish baths was extraordinary. All blue and green tile work in geometric patterns, ornate carved woodwork, bronze lamps that created atmospheric lighting, and comfortable seating where you could relax while sweating out all those 11-course dinners. The whole aesthetic was meant to evoke the hammams of the Ottoman Empire, those legendary bathing establishments that had captured Western imagination as symbols of exotic luxury and sensual indulgence. Whether the actual experience matched the fantasy is debatable, but the decoration was certainly impressive and represented a significant investment in creating an immersive environment. The Turkish baths, like the swimming pool, were gender segregated with separate hours for men and women. They also required additional payment beyond your ticket price, which meant that only the most dedicated or most wealthy passengers would use them regularly. The baths were meant to be therapeutic, promoting health and wellness through the application of heat and steam, and vigorous scrubbing by attendants who were presumably trained in the ancient art of making people uncomfortably hot and then splashing them with cold water. The whole experience was supposed to leave you feeling refreshed and invigorated, though in practice it probably just made you sweaty and tired and in need of a nap. The baths were operated by attendants who managed the steam systems, maintained the cleanliness of the facilities, and provided the various services that wealthy Edwardians expected when paying for luxury bathing experiences. These attendants were part of the ship's crew, working in hot, humid conditions to ensure that passengers could enjoy their recreational steaming in comfort. The contrast between the working conditions of the bath attendants and the luxurious experience of the passengers using the baths exemplifies the broader class divisions that permeated every aspect of the ship. Now let's talk about the gymnasium, because this is where things get truly weird. The gymnasium was located on the boat deck, giving it natural light from the windows and making it easily accessible to passengers who wanted to exercise between meals and social obligations. The gym was equipped with the latest exercise equipment available in 1912, which by modern standards looks like a collection of medieval torture devices designed by someone who'd heard about exercise but never actually seen it performed. There were rowing machines, which are still recognizable as exercise equipment today. There were stationary bicycles, which make sense as cardio machines. And then there were the electric horses and electric camels, which require some explanation, because what the actual hell? The electric horse was exactly what it sounds like, a mechanical horse that you sat on, and it moved to simulate the motion of riding a real horse. This was meant to provide the exercise benefits of horseback riding without requiring an actual horse, which would have been impractical on a ship for various reasons, including limited space, the difficulty of keeping a living animal aboard, and the simple fact that horses don't particularly enjoy ocean travel. The electric horse would rock and move beneath you, and you had to maintain your balance and posture, which apparently provided a workout for your core muscles and your sense of dignity. The electric camel was similar but even more absurd, simulating the swaying motion of riding a camel, which is quite different from the motion of riding a horse, and apparently was meant to provide a different type of exercise. Why anyone thought passengers needed to simulate camel riding while crossing the Atlantic is unclear, but there it was, a mechanical camel in the middle of the ship's gymnasium, waiting for passengers brave enough or bored enough to give it a try. Using these contraptions required a certain commitment to the idea of exercise as entertainment, a willingness to look somewhat ridiculous while mounted on a mechanical animal that was bucking and swaying in the middle of a moving ship. The gymnasium also had various weight machines, though these were quite different from modern weight machines. They used weights and pulleys in ways that seem unnecessarily complicated, requiring you to pull or push against resistance in specific patterns that were supposed to develop particular muscle groups. There was something called a health and vigor developer, which sounds like a scam product from a late-night infomercial, but was apparently a legitimate piece of exercise equipment that used resistance training to build strength. The whole collection of equipment looked steampunk before steampunk was a concept, all leather and metal and mechanical complexity in service of the simple goal of making people sweat. The gymnasium was supervised by a physical instructor, a crew member whose job was to help passengers use the equipment properly and to provide guidance on exercise routines. This was necessary because the equipment was complicated enough that you could potentially injure yourself if you used it incorrectly, and also because wealthy Edwardians were not generally accustomed to operating complicated machinery themselves. The physical instructor would demonstrate the equipment, suggest exercises appropriate to your fitness level, and generally ensure that nobody did anything too foolish with the mechanical camels. The gym was popular with some passengers, particularly men who were interested in maintaining their physical fitness, and who found the equipment novel and entertaining. Women could use the gym during designated hours, though female passengers were less likely to engage in vigorous exercise given the social expectations around feminine behavior and the restrictive nature of even exercise clothing for women in 1912. The idea that women should engage in serious athletic activity was still somewhat controversial, though it was becoming more accepted as the new century progressed and women began pushing back against the restrictions of Victorian femininity. Using the gymnasium was free with your first-class ticket, unlike the swimming pool and Turkish baths, which made it more accessible to passengers who weren't willing to pay extra for recreational facilities. The gym was open during specified hours each day, and passengers could drop in as they liked to use the equipment. Some passengers developed regular exercise routines, visiting the gym every morning before breakfast to work off the previous evening's dinner and prepare for the coming day's eating marathon. Others tried the equipment once out of curiosity, discovered that mechanical camels were not as entertaining as they'd hoped, and never returned. But perhaps the most revolutionary amenity on Titanic, the one that represented the cutting edge of technology and communication in 1912, was the wireless telegraph system. The ship had a Marconi wireless room located on the boat deck, staffed by 2 wireless operators who worked in shifts to maintain 24-hour communication capability. This wireless system could send and receive messages over hundreds of miles, connecting the ship to other vessels and to shore stations, providing a communication link that would have seemed like magic to people just a generation earlier who had no way to communicate with ships once they left port. The wireless operators were employees of the Marconi Company, not White Star Line, which was standard practice at the time. They operated the wireless equipment, sending and receiving messages using Morse code, managing the traffic of communications that came through the system. First-class passengers could send personal messages called Marconigrams to people on shore or on other ships, for a fee of course, because every service on this ship had a price. These messages were limited in length and could take time to transmit depending on how busy the wireless system was, but they allowed passengers to maintain contact with the world beyond the ship in a way that had never been possible before. The wireless system was primarily used for personal messages from wealthy passengers who wanted to send business communications or social correspondence while at sea. Stock market updates could be received, allowing passengers to keep track of their investments. News from shore could be transmitted to the ship, keeping passengers informed about world events. Weather information could be received from other ships and shore stations, providing captains with data that could help in navigation and route planning. The wireless telegraph represented a fundamental shift in how ships operated, transforming them from isolated vessels cut off from the world into connected nodes in a global communication network. But the wireless system had limitations that would prove tragic. The operators were busy during the day sending passenger messages, and these personal communications took priority over other types of messages because they generated revenue. When other ships sent ice warnings, reporting dangerous ice fields in the North Atlantic, these warnings were received but not always given immediate attention because the operators were focused on the paying customer traffic. The Titanic's wireless operators were dealing with a backlog of passenger messages on the night of April 14th, which may have contributed to the failure to adequately respond to ice warnings from other vessels. The ship also had a squash racket court, located on G-deck in the forward part of the vessel, which was another amenity that seems bizarre on a ship but was actually quite popular with athletic passengers. Squash, or rackets as it was sometimes called, was a gentleman's sport in 1912, played in private clubs by wealthy men who enjoyed vigorous athletic competition. Having a squash court on the ship meant that passengers could maintain their exercise routines even while crossing the ocean, playing matches against each other or with the ship's squash professional who was available to give lessons and arrange games. The squash court was a dedicated room with walls suitable for bouncing the ball, proper flooring, and adequate height for playing the game. It was located deep in the ship where space was available, and where the noise of balls hitting walls wouldn't disturb other passengers. Using the court required a reservation and payment of a fee, and equipment could be rented if you hadn't brought your own racket. The court was primarily used by men, as women in 1912 were not generally expected to engage in vigorous sports like squash, though there's no indication that women were explicitly forbidden from using the facility if they wanted to. Playing squash on a moving ship must have added an interesting challenge to the game, as the motion of the vessel would affect the ball's trajectory and the player's balance. But apparently some passengers enjoyed the novelty of it, and the squash court was one of the ship's recreational amenities that saw regular use from the athletic portion of the first-class population. It represented the extent to which White Star Line was trying to provide every possible amenity that wealthy passengers might want, creating a floating resort that could compete with the best athletic clubs on land. All of these recreational facilities, from the swimming pool to the squash court to the gymnasium with its electric camels, were marketed as part of what made Titanic special, what justified the premium ticket prices and made the ship the most desirable way to cross the Atlantic. They were symbols of modernity and progress, evidence that technology could provide comfort and entertainment in any environment, even in the middle of the ocean. They appealed to a particular vision of luxury that combined traditional elegance with modern convenience, that preserved the formality and ritual of Edwardian society while incorporating the latest technological advances. The recreational facilities also reflected changing attitudes about health and fitness in the early 20th century. The Victorian era had been characterized by relatively sedentary lifestyles for wealthy people, particularly women, who were expected to avoid vigorous exercise as unladylike. But by 1912, ideas about health and fitness were shifting. Exercise was increasingly seen as beneficial, as something that promoted wellness and vitality, rather than as an undignified activity suitable only for labourers and athletes. The presence of a gymnasium and swimming pool on Titanic reflected these changing attitudes, suggesting that even wealthy passengers travelling in luxury could benefit from physical activity. Of course, the actual use of these facilities was probably quite limited compared to their availability. Most first-class passengers were more interested in eating, socialising and enjoying the ship's luxury than in working out in the gymnasium or swimming laps in the pool. The recreational facilities were there for the passengers who wanted them, and they were certainly used, but they weren't central to the first-class experience the way the dining room and lounges were. For many passengers, the existence of these facilities was more important than actually using them, a form of luxury that consisted of having options even if you never exercised those options. The technology throughout the ship, from the heated swimming pool to the wireless telegraph to the electric camels in the gymnasium, represented the cutting edge of what was possible in 1912. Titanic was designed to showcase technological progress, to demonstrate that human ingenuity could overcome the challenges of ocean travel and provide unprecedented levels of comfort and convenience. The ship had electric lights throughout the first-class areas, electric elevators to move between decks, electric heaters in the staterooms, electric fans for ventilation. Electricity, which was still relatively new in many homes, was used extensively throughout the ship to power amenities that made life more comfortable for passengers. The heating system was another technological marvel, using steam from the ship's boilers to provide warmth throughout the vessel. This was particularly important in the North Atlantic in April, when temperatures could be quite cold even inside the ship. The heating system was sophisticated enough to allow different areas to be heated to different temperatures, with controls in individual staterooms that let passengers adjust the warmth to their preference. This level of climate control was far beyond what most homes had in 1912, making the ship more comfortable than the mansions that many passengers lived in on land. The ventilation system was equally important, using a combination of natural airflow and mechanical fans to ensure fresh air circulation throughout the ship. This was crucial for maintaining comfort in spaces like the dining saloon and lounges where large numbers of people would gather, generating heat and consuming oxygen. The ventilation system also helped manage the smoke from the engines and from the many cigars that were smoked in the first-class areas, removing stale air and replacing it with fresh air from outside. It was sophisticated environmental management for the era, showing how technology could create comfortable environments even in the challenging setting of a large ship. The plumbing system was another technological achievement, providing hot and cold running water to bathrooms throughout the first-class section. This required extensive piping, water storage tanks, heating systems to warm the water, and pumps to maintain pressure throughout the system. The fact that you could turn on a tap in your stateroom and get hot water immediately was genuinely impressive in 1912, when many homes still relied on water heated on stoves and carried in buckets. The ship's plumbing represented a level of convenience that was at the cutting edge of residential comfort for the era. All of this technology required maintenance and operation by skilled crew members who worked throughout the voyage to keep systems running smoothly. Engineers managed the electrical systems, plumbers maintained the water systems, heating specialists ensured the climate control was working properly, wireless operators kept the communication systems functioning. These crew members were essential to the operation of the ship, but were largely invisible to first-class passengers who experienced the results of their work without seeing the labour required to maintain all these technological systems. The revolutionary amenities on Titanic were designed to make the crossing from Southampton to New York as comfortable and entertaining as possible, to transform what had traditionally been a necessary but uncomfortable journey into a luxury experience that was desirable in itself. The ship wasn't just transportation, it was a destination, a floating resort where you could exercise in a gymnasium, swim in a heated pool, relax in Turkish baths, communicate with people on shore via wireless telegraph, and generally enjoy amenities that were unavailable on most other ships, and in many cases unavailable in most homes and hotels on land. But all of this technology, all these amenities, all this comfort and luxury, existed within a vessel that was fundamentally at the mercy of the ocean. The ship might have electric lights and heated swimming pools and wireless communications, but it was still a steel hull floating on water, subject to the forces of nature that no amount of technology could completely overcome. The wireless system could communicate with other ships but couldn't prevent icebergs from drifting into the shipping lanes. The watertight compartments and advanced hull design could provide some protection against flooding, but weren't sufficient to save the ship if enough damage occurred. The technology provided comfort and convenience, but it also created a sense of security that may have been unwarranted. The recreational facilities and technological amenities on Titanic represented the optimism of the early 20th century, the belief that human ingenuity and technology could solve any problem and overcome any challenge. They were symbols of progress and modernity, evidence that the future would be better than the past because we would make it so through our own efforts and innovations. This optimism was genuine and in many ways justified, as technology really was transforming human life in beneficial ways. But it was also perhaps overconfident, insufficiently aware of the limitations of technology and the persistence of dangers that couldn't be engineered away. For the passengers who used these facilities, who swam in the heated pool or exercised on the electric camels or sent Marconigrams via the wireless system, the experience must have been exciting and somewhat magical, a glimpse of a future where technology would make all aspects of life more comfortable and convenient. They were participating in something new, something that previous generations couldn't have imagined, enjoying amenities that represented genuine progress in human capability. And for a few days, everything worked perfectly. The pool was warm, the gymnasium equipment functioned as designed, the wireless system connected the ship to the wider world. It all seemed to validate the optimistic vision of technology in service of comfort, the idea that human beings could create whatever environment they wanted regardless of where they were or what challenges they faced. The tragedy that ended the voyage makes it impossible to view these amenities with pure admiration, but they still represent genuine achievements in engineering and design. Creating a heated swimming pool on a ship in 1912 was genuinely impressive work. Building a gymnasium with complex mechanical equipment was a real accomplishment. Installing a wireless telegraph system that could communicate over hundreds of miles was cutting-edge technology that really did transform how ships operated. These weren't gimmicks or mere luxuries. They were functional examples of how technology could improve human life, how engineering skill and creative thinking could provide comfort and convenience in challenging environments. The recreational facilities on Titanic were used by passengers for only a few days before the ship sank. But for those days, they represented something significant. The idea that humans could create their own reality, could build environments that suited their preferences regardless of external circumstances, could use technology to transcend the limitations of nature and geography. It was an idea that would continue to drive technological development throughout the 20th century, sometimes successfully and sometimes with tragic failures like the Titanic disaster itself. But in April 1912, for the passengers exercising in the gymnasium, or swimming in the heated pool or relaxing in the Turkish baths, these amenities were simply part of the remarkable experience of travelling first class on the most advanced ship ever built, enjoying comforts that seemed like they belonged to the future rather than to their present moment. And in that sense, at least for a brief time, the revolutionary amenities of Titanic really did deliver on their promise, providing an experience of luxury and technology that passengers would remember for the rest of their lives, however long or short those lives turned out to be. After eating your way through breakfast, exercising briefly on an electric camel to justify the eating, and perhaps taking a therapeutic steam in the Turkish baths, you might think first-class passengers would spend the rest of the day relaxing in their cabins or quietly reading in a lounge. But no, because the social life on Titanic was as structured and demanding as everything else in first class, governed by unwritten rules and expected behaviours that were just as rigid as the dress codes we've already discussed. Your day wasn't your own to spend as you wished. It was a series of social performances and obligations that required constant participation and awareness, because being seen doing the right things in the right places at the right times was almost as important as actually doing them. The day for most first-class passengers began relatively early by modern vacation standards, though not unreasonably so. By 8 a.m, the more energetic passengers were already up and dressed in their morning attire, ready to participate in one of the most important daily rituals of first-class life, the morning constitutional on the promenade deck. This wasn't just a casual stroll, it was a social institution with its own expectations and etiquette, a performance of health consciousness and social connection that required appropriate clothing, proper behaviour, and the stamina to walk in circles for an extended period while making pleasant conversation with other passengers. The promenade deck, located on the boat deck and a deck, was a covered walkway that ran along the sides of the ship, providing a protected space where passengers could walk while enjoying fresh air and ocean views without being exposed to the full force of wind and weather. The deck was made of teak planking, which provided a good walking surface and looked appropriately nautical, and it was wide enough to accommodate multiple people walking abreast. The covering overhead protected walkers from sun and rain, which was essential for maintaining the pale complexions that were fashionable among Edwardian upper classes who wanted to look like they never performed manual labour outdoors. The morning constitutional was considered essential for health, part of the Edwardian belief that fresh air and moderate exercise promoted wellness and vitality. Medical wisdom of the era suggested that adults should walk at least a certain distance daily, and for passengers on a ship with limited space, walking laps around the promenade deck was the practical solution. The general recommendation was 10 laps minimum, which worked out to roughly a mile depending on which deck you walked and how you counted the turns. Some passengers took this recommendation very seriously, keeping careful count of their laps and ensuring they met their daily quota. Others were more casual about it, walking until they got bored or encountered someone interesting to talk to. The morning walk was also a prime opportunity for social observation and connection. Everyone who was anyone in first class would be on the promenade deck at some point during the morning hours, which meant you could see who was aboard, who was travelling with whom, what people were wearing, and generally gather all the social intelligence that was so important for navigating first-class society. You could strike up conversations with other passengers, renew acquaintances made at dinner the previous evening, or simply observe the social dynamics playing out around you. The promenade deck during morning hours was like a moving stage where everyone was both performer and audience, participating in and watching a daily drama of social interaction. The walking patterns on the promenade were somewhat structured by unspoken convention. People generally walked in the same direction, counterclockwise around the deck, which prevented head-on collisions and created a flowing pattern of movement. Faster walkers could overtake slower walkers on the inside, while those who wanted to take their time could stay toward the outside rail, where they could also enjoy the ocean views. Groups walking together would naturally form clusters, breaking apart and reforming as they encountered other passengers, or as individuals peeled off to rest on the deck chairs that were positioned along the promenade. The deck chairs themselves were another important element of the social landscape. These were wooden-framed canvas chairs, the kind you still see on old ocean liners and in vintage photographs, positioned along the promenade where passengers could sit and rest while still being part of the social scene. The chairs were assigned to specific passengers who'd claimed them, and there was something of a hierarchy to chair positioning, with the most desirable locations being those that offered good views and proximity to interesting fellow passengers. Your deck chair became a sort of semi-public living room, a place where you could sit and read while still being available for conversation with passing passengers who might stop to chat. The deck chair culture was serious business. Stewards would bring blankets for passengers who wanted to bundle up against the North Atlantic chill, which even in April could be significant out on deck. Some passengers spent hours in their deck chairs, reading books or magazines, writing letters, or simply watching the ocean and their fellow passengers. The deck chair offered a way to be social without being actively engaged, to be present in the first-class community without the demands of formal conversation or structured activities. Reading material was an important part of deck chair life, and more generally of filling the hours between meals and social obligations. Passengers brought books from home, purchased books and magazines at the port before boarding, or borrowed from the ship's library, which offered a selection of current and classic literature. Popular novels, travel writing, biography, history, these were all common reading choices for passengers with time to fill. Women's magazines provided fashion news and society gossip. Men might read newspapers that had been brought aboard at Southampton, though these would obviously become dated as the voyage progressed with no way to get fresh news, except through the wireless telegraph summaries. The social geography of the ship during daytime hours reflected the gender segregation that was so fundamental to Edwardian society. While the promenade decks were mixed spaces where men and women could walk and interact, many of the lounges and social rooms were either formally or informally segregated by gender, providing separate spaces where men and women could relax among their own sex without the performance requirements of mixed company. The reading and writing room, which we've mentioned before, was explicitly designed for female passengers. This room, decorated in light Georgian style with delicate furniture and pale colours, was a refuge where women could write letters, read books, or simply sit and chat with other women away from male presence. The room had writing desks equipped with paper, pens, and ink, allowing passengers to compose letters to friends and family back home. These letters would be posted when the ship reached New York, and they were an important way for passengers to maintain social connections and obligations even while travelling. Letter writing was still a crucial social skill in 1912, before telephones became common and when written correspondence was the primary way to maintain relationships across distance. First-class passengers were expected to be prolific letter writers, keeping up with friends and family, maintaining business connections, and generally participating in the social networks that defined their lives. The reading and writing room provided a dedicated space for this activity, with good lighting, comfortable seating, and the quiet atmosphere appropriate for composition and contemplation. The room also served as a social space where women could gather to chat without male interference. Conversations in the reading and writing room might cover a range of topics: gossip about other passengers, discussion of fashion and society news, exchange of advice on domestic matters, or sharing of travel experiences and recommendations. The room provided a space for female friendship and connection, away from the more formal mixed social spaces where women had to maintain a particular kind of performance for male observers. The smoking room, by contrast, was the male equivalent, a space exclusively for men where they could smoke cigars and cigarettes, drink spirits, and engage in the kind of conversation that Edwardian men apparently couldn't have in the presence of women. This room, decorated in dark mahogany with leather furniture and stained glass windows, looked like a London gentleman's club transplanted onto a ship. The atmosphere was masculine and somewhat libertine, a place where men could relax and be themselves without worrying about proper behaviour for mixed company. The smoking room was open throughout the day, but was particularly busy in the evenings after dinner when men would retire there while women gathered in the lounge or reception room. This post-dinner segregation was standard practice in upper-class Edwardian society, based on the idea that men and women had different interests, and that men wanted to smoke and drink and discuss business or politics without feminine interference. The women's separation was theoretically by choice, allowing them to avoid the smoke and rough conversation of the men's gathering, though in practice it was an enforced social convention that neither sex could easily opt out of without marking themselves as odd. In the smoking room, men would gather in groups around tables, engaging in conversation that could range from business dealings to political debate, to sports discussion, to outright gossip. They would smoke cigars, which were expensive and considered a mark of sophistication and success. They would drink whiskey, brandy, port, or other spirits, often late into the night. Some would play cards, either friendly games for small stakes or more serious gambling that could involve substantial sums of money. The smoking room was where male passengers could establish connections, make deals, exchange information, and generally participate in the homosocial bonding that was so important to male networking in this era. Card games were a major pastime throughout the ship, not just in the smoking room but in various lounges and social spaces. Bridge was particularly popular among the upper classes, a complex trick-taking game that required skill, strategy, and a good memory. Bridge games could occupy hours, with passengers forming regular foursomes that would meet daily to play. Other card games included poker, which was played in the smoking room for money and was considered somewhat risque, and various simpler games like whist that could be played casually without the intense concentration required for bridge. The card games served multiple social functions beyond mere entertainment. They provided structure to otherwise unoccupied time, giving passengers something to do during the long hours between meals and social obligations. They facilitated social mixing, bringing together passengers who might not otherwise interact and creating opportunities for conversation and connection. And they allowed for subtle status displays. A skill at games like bridge was considered a mark of intelligence and sophistication, while willingness to play poker for significant stakes demonstrated both wealth and a certain rakish masculinity. There were also professional gamblers aboard Titanic, as there were on most luxury liners of the era. These were men, almost always men, who made their living playing cards on ships and in the social circles of the wealthy, using superior skill and sometimes outright cheating to separate rich passengers from their money. These professional gamblers were often charming and well-dressed, able to pass as fellow first-class passengers rather than working card sharks. They would ingratiate themselves with wealthy passengers, suggesting friendly card games that would gradually escalate in stakes until substantial sums were being wagered. Some wealthy passengers enjoyed the excitement and didn't mind losing money to professionals, viewing it as payment for entertainment. Others were genuinely fleeced, losing more than they intended to skilled players who knew how to manipulate the games and the psychology of their opponents. The ship's officers and staff were aware of these professional gamblers, but had limited ability to control them as long as they weren't causing obvious problems. The social dynamics of first class made it difficult to police card games, as wealthy passengers would have resented interference in what they viewed as private entertainment. The professional gamblers were skilled at staying just within the bounds of acceptable behaviour, charming enough to be tolerated and careful enough to avoid blatant cheating that would get them reported. They were parasites on the first-class social ecosystem, exploiting the combination of wealth, leisure, and social expectations that created opportunities for their craft. During afternoon hours, the social life on Titanic shifted to different rhythms and spaces. After lunch, many passengers would retire to their cabins for rest. a carryover from the Edwardian habit of the afternoon rest period that was still observed by many wealthy people who could afford to structure their days around comfort and leisure. This rest period wasn't necessarily sleeping, but rather a time to relax in private, perhaps reading or writing letters, or simply lying down away from the social demands of the public spaces. Those who didn't rest might gather in the lounge or other social spaces for conversation and light activities. The lounge, with its Louis XV decoration and comfortable furniture, was a popular afternoon gathering spot, particularly for passengers who wanted to socialize in a more relaxed atmosphere than the formal dining room provided. Small groups would form and reform throughout the afternoon, people chatting about their travel plans, discussing news from home, sharing observations about other passengers, or simply passing time in pleasant company. Afternoon tea, which we've already discussed as a meal, was also a major social event that structured the late afternoon hours. The tea service in the veranda cafe brought together passengers who might have been scattered throughout the ship during earlier hours, creating a focused social gathering where attendance was expected and absence would be noted. Tea was particularly important for women, who used it as an opportunity to see and be seen, to display their afternoon tea dresses, to engage in the social networking that was so crucial to maintaining status and connections in their world. The conversations during tea could cover a wide range of topics, though there were subjects that were considered inappropriate for polite mixed company. Politics could be discussed, but only in general terms and without too much partisan fervour that might create conflict. Business was acceptable for men to discuss among themselves, but not really appropriate for mixed conversations. Fashion and society news were always safe topics. Travel experiences and recommendations could occupy hours of conversation. Gossip about other passengers was inevitable, though it had to be done with some subtlety to maintain the fiction that everyone was being polite and respectful. The social observation that happened constantly throughout the day was both entertainment and information gathering. Passengers would note who was dining with whom, who was spending time together on deck, who seemed to be pursuing whom, what the social connections and dynamics were among the first-class passengers. This observation served practical purposes in helping passengers navigate the social world of the ship, understanding who was important, who was approachable, who to avoid, and who might be useful connections to cultivate. But it was also just inherently interesting watching the human drama play out in this confined space where everyone was constantly on display. The children could play on deck, run in spaces where adults would walk sedately, make noise that would be inappropriate for adults. They might have nannies or governesses travelling with them, employees of wealthy families whose job was to manage the children and keep them occupied and out of their parents' way. The children's social life was probably the freest on the ship, less burdened by the expectations and performances that dominated adult first-class life. The evening hours brought a shift in social dynamics as passengers prepared for dinner and the formal evening social life that followed. We've already discussed the dinner service itself, but the post-dinner social life was its own elaborate ritual. After dinner, passengers would gather in various lounges and social spaces, the men eventually separating to the smoking room while the women gathered in the reception room or lounge. This segregation would last for an hour or more, allowing each gender to socialise separately before potentially reuniting for later evening activities. In the reception room, women would sit on comfortable furniture, drinking coffee or perhaps cordials, engaging in conversation that was probably more relaxed and honest than what was possible in mixed company. Without men present, women could discuss topics that might be considered inappropriate for mixed conversation, could gossip more freely, could express opinions that might be suppressed in male presence. The women's gathering was its own form of community, a space for female friendship and solidarity within the largely patriarchal structure of Edwardian society. Meanwhile, in the smoking room, men were engaged in their own version of bonding, smoking cigars that cost more than many working people earned in a week, drinking expensive spirits, and engaging in conversation that could be more profane and direct than what was acceptable in mixed company. The smoking room conversations could cover business in detail, could include political arguments that might be too heated for mixed company, could involve the kind of off-colour jokes and stories that weren't appropriate when women were present. It was a space for men to be themselves, or at least to be the version of themselves that they presented to other men of their class. Some evenings there might be organised entertainment in the form of ship's concerts, where passengers with musical ability would perform for their fellow travellers. These concerts were informal affairs, not professional performances, but rather talented amateurs sharing their skills with an appreciative audience. Someone might play piano, another might sing, others might perform instrumental pieces. The concerts provided entertainment and also opportunities for passengers to display their accomplishments, as musical ability was considered a marker of good breeding and education in Edwardian society. Dancing sometimes happened in the reception room or other spaces, though on this particular voyage there wasn't much organised dancing as the maiden voyage was still in progress and social structures were still forming. But on longer voyages or later in crossings, dancing was common, with passengers organising informal balls where they could dance to music provided by the ship's orchestra, or even just by passengers with instruments. Dancing was an important social skill in 1912, and wealthy passengers would have been trained in all the popular dances of the era, from waltzes to newer dances that were just becoming fashionable. The ship's orchestra performed during dinner and at other times when musical accompaniment was appropriate. The musicians were employed by the ship to provide entertainment and atmosphere, and they were skilled professionals who could play a wide repertoire of classical pieces, popular songs and dance music. The presence of live music throughout the ship was part of what made first-class travel feel luxurious and civilized, a reminder that this wasn't just transportation, but a total environment designed for pleasure and comfort. Late evening, after the women and men had reunited from their separate gatherings, some passengers would remain in the lounges talking and drinking into the early morning hours. Others would retire to their cabins, exhausted from the day's social performances and ready for sleep before beginning the whole cycle again the next morning. The late-night gatherings were more intimate and relaxed, with only the most dedicated socializers and the most fervent drinkers still present, and conversations could become more personal and honest, as fatigue and alcohol lowered the usual social guards. The daily rhythm of social life on Titanic was structured and repetitive, with the same activities happening at roughly the same times each day. This repetition created a sense of routine and stability that many passengers found comforting, a predictable structure that organized the otherwise unstructured time of the ocean crossing. The repetition also allowed for the development of patterns and connections, as passengers who encountered each other repeatedly in the same spaces and activities could develop acquaintances and even friendships over the course of the voyage. But the social life was also intensely performed, requiring constant awareness of how you were being perceived and constant management of your public presentation. Every appearance in public spaces was an opportunity to be observed and evaluated by other passengers. What you wore, how you behaved, who you talked to, how you carried yourself, all of these were data points that other passengers would use to determine your social status and whether you were the kind of person worth knowing. The pressure to always be on, to always be performing the role of a sophisticated first-class passenger, must have been exhausting for some people, particularly those who weren't naturally extroverted or who weren't completely comfortable in these elite social circles. Women were expected to be refined, decorative, concerned with domestic and social matters but not with business or politics. Men were expected to be strong, decisive, capable in the worlds of business and politics, but perhaps somewhat rough around the edges in social situations. The separate spaces allowed each gender to relax somewhat from these performative roles, though the expectations didn't really disappear even in single-gender gatherings. The segregation also reflected practical considerations around smoking and drinking. The heavy smoke in the smoking room would have been unpleasant for many women, and the Edwardian assumption was that women preferred to avoid it. Similarly, the heavy drinking that happened in the smoking room was considered masculine behaviour, inappropriate for respectable women who might have a glass of wine with dinner, or perhaps a cordial in the evening, but weren't expected to match the quantity of alcohol that men consumed. But the segregation was also limiting and frustrating for people who didn't fit neatly into these gender roles, or who simply enjoyed mixed company. Women who were interested in business or politics had to pretend they weren't in order to maintain their respectability. Men who preferred quieter, more refined socializing had to participate in the smoking room culture to avoid being seen as unmanly. The rigid gender expectations created pressure on everyone to conform to roles that might not reflect their actual interests or personalities. The social life on Titanic was also complicated by the status hierarchies within first class that we've discussed before. Not all first-class passengers were social equals, and the subtle distinctions of wealth and breeding created invisible boundaries within the supposedly unified first-class community. The Astors and Guggenheims were at the top of the social hierarchy, and ordinary first-class passengers might not presume to approach them casually. Professional people travelling first class were respectable, but not necessarily part of the most elite social circles. The social navigation required to understand these distinctions and behave appropriately was complex, and demanded careful observation and social intelligence. Some passengers hired social secretaries or companions specifically to help them navigate the social world of luxury travel. These employees, usually women helping other women, would provide guidance on appropriate behaviour, help manage social obligations like correspondence and calling cards, and generally assist in the social performance that first-class life required. Having a social secretary was itself a status symbol, demonstrating that you had enough wealth and enough social ambition to need professional help managing your social life. The calling card system was part of how social connections were managed and formalised. Passengers would exchange calling cards, small printed cards with their names and sometimes addresses, as a way of acknowledging acquaintance and expressing interest in future contact. The calling card ritual had elaborate rules about when and how to present cards, what kinds of interactions required card exchange, and how to interpret the cards you received from others. Managing your calling card relationships was serious business in Edwardian society, and first-class passengers would have brought stacks of cards with them to use during the voyage. The social world of first class on Titanic was, in many ways, a microcosm of elite Edwardian society more broadly, with all its rituals and hierarchies and performances condensed into the confined space of a ship. It was simultaneously genuine community, as passengers really did form connections and friendships during these voyages, and artificial performance, as everyone was constantly aware of being observed and evaluated. It was both enjoyable social interaction and exhausting social labour, both the pleasure of human connection and the burden of constant self-presentation. For passengers travelling alone, the social life was particularly important, as it provided companionship and community during what could otherwise be a lonely journey. Single women travelling, which was still somewhat unusual in 1912, could find female friendship and support in the reading and writing room and at afternoon tea. Single men could find male camaraderie in the smoking room, and through shared activities like the morning constitutional or card games. The ship created opportunities for social connection that might not exist in the more dispersed and private social world on land. But for all, these people were thrown together by circumstance, sharing space for a brief period before dispersing to their separate lives in New York or wherever else their travels took them. Some connections made during the voyage would persist after landing, particularly among people who moved in the same social circles and would encounter each other again in New York or London society. But many of the friendships and acquaintances formed on the ship were temporary, intense connections that existed only in the special environment of the voyage and wouldn't survive the return to normal life on land. The daily rituals and social traditions of first-class life on Titanic represented both continuity and change in elite social life. The rituals preserved traditional patterns of behaviour, maintaining the gender segregation and formal social performances that had characterized upper-class life for generations. But they also adapted to the new environment of modern ocean liner travel, creating new traditions around promenading on deck and using the ship's various amenities. The result was a social world that was simultaneously very old-fashioned in its formality and quite modern in its setting and technology. For historians looking back at the social life on Titanic, one of the striking things is how much effort and energy went into maintaining these social rituals and performances in what was ultimately a very temporary and artificial environment. The passengers on Titanic spent enormous amounts of time and attention on social observation and social performance, on maintaining proper appearances and following correct protocols, even though the whole community would dissolve in less than a week when the ship reached New York. This devotion to social ritual, even in temporary circumstances, shows how deeply embedded these behaviours were in upper-class culture, how automatic and essential the social performances had become to these people's sense of identity and belonging. The social life on Titanic was also one of the last great expressions of Edwardian social culture before the First World War swept away much of the old social order. Within a few years, many of the rigid social conventions that governed behaviour on Titanic would begin to break down under the pressures of war and social change. Gender segregation would become less absolute as women gained more independence and social freedoms. The elaborate dress codes would simplify as fashion became more practical. The extreme formality of social interaction would give way to somewhat more casual and democratic styles of socializing. But in April 1912, all of that was still in the future, and the passengers on Titanic were living according to social rules that seemed permanent and unchangeable, engaging in rituals that felt natural and essential rather than artificial, and soon to be obsolete. The tragedy that ended the voyage also ended many of the social connections and communities that had formed during those few days at sea. Passengers who had become friends would be separated, some surviving and some not. The social world that had been created through all those morning walks and afternoon teas and evening gatherings would be shattered. But for the days before the disaster, the social life on Titanic represented something significant. A community of wealthy people engaging in the rituals and traditions that defined their world, creating connections and enjoying human society, even in the confined and artificial environment of a luxury ocean liner. It was both the peak and the beginning of the end of a particular kind of elite social life, a final flowering of Edwardian social culture before everything changed forever. If you thought the daytime social rituals of first class were elaborate and demanding, the evening ceremonies made everything that came before look like casual warm-up exercises. Because nighttime on Titanic wasn't just a continuation of the day with different lighting, it was a completely different performance that required costume changes, social recalibration, and a level of formality that would make a state dinner look relaxed. The transformation from day to evening was like watching a theatre company shift from rehearsal to opening night, except every single night was opening night, and every single passenger was both actor and audience, in a production that had been running with minor variations for generations. The evening began around 5 or 6 p.m, when passengers would start retiring to their cabins to begin the lengthy process of preparing for dinner. For women, this wasn't just changing clothes, it was a complete transformation that could easily take an hour or more even with the help of a lady's maid. For men, the process was somewhat simpler, but still required careful attention to detail and the achievement of absolute sartorial perfection. The goal was to appear downstairs in the first-class dining saloon at 7:30 p.m, looking like you'd been born wearing formal evening attire, as if this level of elegance was simply your natural state, rather than the product of significant effort and discomfort. For women, the transformation began with the removal of day clothes and the reconstruction of the entire body silhouette using that most ingenious of Victorian inventions, the corset. Evening corsets were often even more restrictive than daytime versions, because the evening gowns required a specific shape that nature hadn't provided, and that could only be achieved through significant compression of the torso. The corset would be laced tightly, often by a lady's maid since doing it yourself was nearly impossible, cinching the waist to the smallest possible circumference, while pushing the bust up and the hips back to create the S-curve silhouette that was fashionable in the early 1910s. This process required holding onto furniture and breathing shallowly, while someone else pulled the laces tighter and tighter until you achieved the desired shape, which is to say, the desired amount of oxygen deprivation. The corset fitting was followed by the construction of the understructure that would support the evening gown. Petticoats, multiple petticoats, because the gowns needed volume and shape that required support underneath. Stocking secured with garters, because elastic hadn't made it into women's undergarments yet and nothing stayed up on its own. Perhaps a brassiere, which was still relatively new technology in 1912 and wasn't universally adopted yet, with many women still relying on corsets alone for bust support. The whole undergarment situation was engineering on par with bridge construction, creating a foundation that could support the elaborate gown while remaining invisible beneath it. The evening gown itself was a production that required careful handling and often assistance to put on. These weren't simple slip-on dresses, they were elaborate constructions with multiple closures, often at the back where you couldn't reach them yourself, requiring a lady's maid or helpful travelling companion to manage the fastenings. The gowns were made from expensive fabrics like silk, satin, velvet, or combinations thereof, often with elaborate embellishments like beading, embroidery, lace inserts, or sequins that caught the light. The colours varied but tended toward rich, deep tones or elegant pastels, nothing too bright or garish that might seem unsophisticated. The silhouette of evening gowns in 1912 was distinctive and quite different from both earlier Victorian styles and later 1920s fashions. The waist was still emphasised, but the overall shape was becoming more columnar, less of the extreme hourglass that had dominated earlier years. The necklines were often low, showing off the décolletage in a way that was acceptable in evening wear, but would have been scandalous in daytime attire. The skirts were long and full, often with trains that trailed behind, requiring careful management to avoid tripping or catching them in doorways. Over the gown, many women wore additional accessories. Opera gloves that extended past the elbow, usually in white or cream kid leather, which had their own etiquette about when to wear them and when to remove them. A fur stole or evening wrap for warmth when moving through cooler parts of the ship, usually made from expensive furs like mink or ermine that cost more than most people's annual wages. Perhaps a fan, which was still a fashionable accessory in 1912, though more for decoration than actual cooling purposes. The accumulation of layers and accessories meant that wealthy women were often uncomfortably warm, even in the relatively cool ship environment, but comfort was emphatically not the point of evening dress. And then we get to the jewellery, which for wealthy women was where the real display of wealth happened. Evening wear was the appropriate context for wearing your most impressive gems, the pieces that were too showy for daytime but perfectly suited for the formal evening environment. Diamond necklaces that represented fortunes, worn at the throat or draping across the décolletage, earrings that caught every light and threw sparkles across the dining room, bracelets, often multiple bracelets in gold or platinum set with precious stones, rings on multiple fingers, because apparently one ring per hand was insufficient to properly display your wealth, tiaras or elaborate hair ornaments for the most formal occasions, turning every evening into a slightly less official version of a royal ball. The jewellery served multiple purposes beyond simple decoration. It was a portable form of wealth, a way to carry significant value in a form that was both secure and displayable. It was a status symbol, announcing to everyone who saw it that you had money to spare for objects that served no practical purpose beyond looking expensive. And it was a form of armour, a way to announce your place in the social hierarchy before you even open your mouth. The woman wearing a diamond necklace worth thousands of dollars was clearly someone important, someone worth knowing, or at least someone worth not offending. Hairstyling for evening was its own elaborate production. The fashionable hairstyles of 1912 were complex updos that required significant time and skill to create, often incorporating false hairpieces to add volume and length. Hair would be pomaded and pinned and puffed and arranged into towering constructions that added inches to a woman's height and provided surfaces for securing the elaborate hair ornaments and tiaras that completed the evening look. Women with naturally curly or wavy hair might spend hours getting their hair arranged properly. Women with straight hair used various techniques and products to create the volume and texture that was fashionable. The whole process was time-consuming and uncomfortable, requiring sitting still for extended periods while a lady's maid worked on your head with pins and combs, and probably a fair amount of muttered cursing when things didn't cooperate. Makeup in 1912 was theoretically not worn by respectable women, or at least not worn obviously. The ideal was to look naturally beautiful, with perfect complexion and colour that suggested you were just blessed with good skin and rosy cheeks, rather than achieving that look through artificial means. But of course many women did use various cosmetics, they just had to be subtle about it. A bit of powder to even out skin tone and control shine. Some rouge on the cheeks and lips, applied carefully so it looked natural. Perhaps some darkening of the eyebrows or lashes using preparations that were probably somewhat toxic but achieved the desired effect. The art was in making it look like you weren't wearing anything, in creating an enhanced version of natural beauty that didn't announce itself as artificial. The entire transformation from day dress to evening attire could easily take an hour or more, sometimes closer to 2 hours for women who were particularly meticulous about their appearance, or who were wearing especially complicated gowns and jewellery. And this was happening every single evening of the voyage, this complete reconstruction of self in service of the formal dinner that was the centrepiece of first-class social life. The dedication required to maintain this level of presentation night after night is honestly impressive, a testament to how deeply these social performances were embedded in upper-class culture. Men had a somewhat easier time of it, but easier is relative when we're discussing Edwardian formal wear. This meant black tailcoat with silk facings on the lapels, cut away at the front to show the waistcoat beneath. White piqué waistcoat which had to be genuinely white and spotless, not off-white or cream or showing any signs of wear. White bow tie, also genuinely white, tied by hand because clip-ons didn't exist and wouldn't have been acceptable anyway. Formal trousers with braiding down the outside seams. Patent leather shoes so shiny you could use them as mirrors. And of course those detachable collars and cuffs we discussed earlier, stiff and uncomfortable and absolutely essential to the proper presentation. The collar situation alone could make getting dressed complicated. The collar had to be attached to the dress shirt using collar studs, small fasteners that went through holes in the collar and shirt. The collar had to be the right height and stiffness, standing up properly without being so tall it cut into your jaw. The bow tie had to be tied correctly, which required practice and skill, creating a neat bow that was symmetrical and appropriately sized. The whole assembly around the neck was restrictive and uncomfortable, basically ensuring that men spent the evening with limited range of motion in their heads and constant awareness of the fabric pressing against their throats. The waistcoat added another layer of formality and discomfort. It had to fit precisely, buttoning up snugly without gaping or pulling. It had to be worn with studs rather than buttons down the front, because buttons were apparently too pedestrian for formal evening wear. The waistcoat served no practical purpose beyond decoration and the maintenance of proper formal appearance, but it was absolutely essential to the white tie ensemble, and omitting it would have been a serious breach of dress code. And then there were the accessories. White gloves for the most formal occasions, though these were often removed once inside the dining room. Cufflinks to secure the detachable cuffs, preferably expensive cufflinks in precious metals with gems or mother of pearl or other signs of quality. A pocket watch on a chain, because wristwatches were still relatively uncommon for men in 1912, and a proper gentleman carried a pocket watch. A white silk or piqué scarf for warmth when moving through cooler parts of the ship. The accumulation of all these elements created a look that was undeniably elegant but also restrictive and uncomfortable in ways that modern formal wear, even black tie, can barely approach. Getting into full white tie regalia took time and attention, even for men who were experienced with formal dress. Everything had to be perfect because imperfection would be noticed and judged. A crooked bow tie, a collar that wasn't properly secured, shoes that weren't shined to perfection. Any of these small failures could mark you as someone who didn't really belong in first class, or who wasn't taking the formal requirements seriously enough. The pressure to get every detail right created stress even for wealthy men who were accustomed to formal dress codes. By 7:15 p.m. or so, passengers would begin making their way from their cabins to the dining saloon, and this was when the real performance began. Women would descend carefully, managing their long gowns and trains while also trying to look graceful and elegant rather than like they were concentrating on not falling down the stairs. Men would escort women, offering arms for support, creating couples and groups that moved through the space in a choreographed flow of formal elegance. The grand staircase in the evening was even more impressive than during the day, lit by electric lights that showed off the carved oak and gilt ironwork while creating dramatic shadows and highlights. The passengers descending in their evening finery added human decoration to the architectural splendour, creating a scene that probably looked like something out of a fashion magazine or a society photograph. Everyone was on display, everyone was being observed, and everyone knew it. The staircase became a runway, a stage, a space where wealth and beauty and social status were performed for an audience that was simultaneously performing the same roles. At 7:30 p.m, a trumpet would sound, announcing that dinner service was beginning. The trumpeter would play a traditional tune called The Roast Beef of Old England, a piece of music that had been associated with dining in British naval tradition and had been adopted by luxury liners as an appropriately formal and traditional dinner call. The sound of the trumpet echoing through the first-class areas was both practical, informing passengers that it was time to head to the dining room, and ceremonial, adding gravitas and ritual to the evening meal. It was one of those small touches that elevated dinner from a simple meal to an event, a ceremony that required proper announcement. The dining saloon in the evening was transformed from its daytime state. The lighting was softer and more dramatic, creating an intimate atmosphere despite the large number of people in the room. The tables were set with even more elaborate settings than at lunch. More silverware, more glassware, more formal presentation. Fresh flowers adorned every table, elaborate centerpieces that had been maintained or replaced throughout the day. The linens were pristine white damask, probably changed between lunch and dinner to ensure perfect presentation. The china and crystal gleamed under the electric lights, everything polished and perfect. The service during dinner was equally elevated. More waiters were on duty for the evening meal, ensuring that the elaborate 11-course service could be executed smoothly. The waiters wore formal attire themselves, white jackets and black trousers, looking like they could have been guests rather than staff if not for their serving duties. The wine service was more elaborate than at lunch, with sommeliers helping passengers select appropriate wines for each course, and ensuring that glasses were filled and empty bottles were removed with seamless efficiency. The whole operation was orchestrated like a ballet, with waiters moving through the room in coordinated patterns, courses arriving simultaneously at tables across the dining saloon, every element timed for maximum effect. During dinner, the ship's orchestra played, providing background music that was audible but not intrusive, creating atmosphere without overwhelming conversation. The orchestra was positioned where they could be heard throughout the dining room, and they played a repertoire of classical pieces and popular melodies that were appropriate for elegant dining. The music added another layer of sophistication to the experience, reinforcing the sense that this wasn't just a meal, but a complete sensory experience designed to please and impress. The conversations during dinner were governed by unwritten rules about appropriate topics and behaviour. Business was acceptable for men to discuss briefly, but wasn't the focus of dinner conversation, which was meant to be pleasant and social rather than transactional. Fashion, travel, society news, cultural events, these were all safe topics that could occupy dinner conversation without risking controversy. The art of dinner conversation was in being interesting and engaged without being too serious or intense, in keeping things light and pleasant while also demonstrating your education and sophistication. After dinner, around 9:30 or 10 p.m, the traditional gender segregation would commence. The men would retire to the smoking room while the women gathered in the reception room or lounge, a separation that was so expected it was almost automatic. No formal announcement was needed, everyone simply understood that this was what happened after dinner, the same way it happened after dinner at private homes and clubs and other elite social venues. The separation would last for at least an hour, often longer, giving each gender time to socialize separately before potentially reuniting later in the evening. The women's gathering in the reception room was a continuation of the dinner performance, but with slightly less rigidity. They could sit more comfortably on the sofas and chairs, though maintaining proper posture was still expected. They could remove their gloves if they wanted, though many kept them on as part of the complete evening look. Coffee and cordials would be served, providing refreshment and something to occupy hands during conversation. The conversations could be more personal and intimate than what was possible at the dinner table with men present, allowing women to discuss topics that might be considered inappropriate for mixed company. The women's conversations might include discussion of the other passengers, analysing who was wearing what and how well they carried themselves. Fashion was always a safe and engaging topic, with women noting the details of each other's gowns and jewellery and hairstyling. Family matters and domestic concerns might be discussed, as these were considered appropriate female topics. Some conversations might veer toward more substantive subjects like literature or art or travel experiences, though always within the bounds of what was considered feminine and appropriate. The women's gathering was both social bonding and competitive display, with each woman aware that she was being evaluated by the others, even as she evaluated them. Meanwhile, in the smoking room, the men were engaging in their own version of post-dinner socializing, one that was centered around cigars, spirits, and the kind of conversation that Edwardian men apparently felt they couldn't have in the presence of women. The smoke, the rich smell of expensive tobacco mixed with the scent of whiskey and brandy, creating an olfactory environment that was distinctly masculine and exclusive. The men would settle into the leather chairs and sofas, loosening their ties slightly now that they were away from mixed company, though still maintaining the basic elements of formal dress. Stewards would circulate with trays of spirits, offering refills and taking orders for specific drinks. The bar in the smoking room did steady business during these evening hours, serving premium whiskies and brandies and other liquors that were expensive enough to mark the drinkers as men of means. The drinking was social rather than deliberately intoxicating, though undoubtedly some men consumed enough alcohol to feel its effects. The conversations in the smoking room could be more frank and direct than what was acceptable in mixed company. Business deals might be discussed in detail, with men exchanging information and making connections that could be valuable in their commercial activities. Political discussions could be more heated and partisan, with men expressing opinions they might moderate in the presence of women. And inevitably there would be some conversation about women, though hopefully with more discretion and respect than the worst stereotypes of male locker room talk might suggest. Card games continued throughout the evening in the smoking room, with some men settling in for serious sessions that might last until well past midnight. Poker games with significant stakes, bridge games that required concentration and skill, other gambling activities that were tolerated in the masculine space of the smoking room, though they might be frowned upon elsewhere. The professional gamblers who made their living on ships like Titanic were particularly active during these evening sessions, cultivating relationships with wealthy passengers and gradually escalating the stakes of their games. The smoking room also served as a space where men could simply escape from the social demands of mixed company and relax somewhat. The performance required during dinner and in the presence of women was exhausting, requiring constant awareness of manners and propriety. In the smoking room, men could let their guard down slightly, could be more themselves, though of course they were still performing masculinity for each other, and still had to maintain certain standards of behaviour appropriate to their class. Some women resented the post-dinner segregation, finding it limiting and infantilizing, as if they couldn't be trusted to handle cigar smoke or serious conversation. But a few progressive women might smoke cigarettes privately in their cabins or in very modern social circles, but doing so openly was still scandalous enough that most avoided it. Later in the evening, perhaps around 11 p.m. or later, The men and women might reunite for additional socializing in the lounges or other spaces. By this time, the formality had relaxed somewhat, with people more tired and the alcohol having its effects on those who'd been drinking steadily. The later evening gatherings were more intimate and casual, with smaller groups forming and conversations becoming more personal. Some passengers retired relatively early, exhausted from the day's social performances and ready for sleep. Others stayed up quite late, enjoying the social atmosphere and the opportunity to connect with fellow passengers without the rigid structure of earlier hours. Dancing occasionally happened during these later evening hours, though it wasn't a regular feature every night. The reception room had space for dancing, and the orchestra could provide appropriate music. Passengers who enjoyed dancing would take advantage of these opportunities, waltzing and performing other popular dances of the era. Dancing was another form of social performance, requiring skill and grace and appropriate partnering. Young people particularly enjoyed these dance sessions, which provided opportunities for flirtation and romantic connection within the acceptable bounds of supervised social activity. The ship's orchestra performed until relatively late, providing music for the later evening gatherings. The musicians were professional and skilled, but they were also employees working long hours to provide entertainment for wealthy passengers who probably didn't think much about the labor required to maintain musical performance throughout the day and evening. The musicians would finally finish their duties around 11 p.m. or midnight, having played during dinner and for several hours of post-dinner entertainment. Throughout the evening, the stewards and other crew members were constantly working to maintain the first-class environment. Waiters cleared the dining room after dinner, cleaning tables and resetting them for the next day's breakfast. Stewards attended to passengers in the lounges and smoking room, providing drinks and responding to requests. Cabins. The work required to maintain the luxury experience was constant and largely invisible to the passengers enjoying that luxury. The evening, the elaborate dress, the formal dinner service, the structured post-dinner segregation and socializing, all of it was choreographed and traditional, following patterns that had been established over generations of upper-class social life. For passengers who were accustomed to these rituals from their normal lives, it was familiar and comfortable, a maintenance of the social order they knew and understood. For passengers who were less experienced with this level of formality, it must have been simultaneously exciting and intimidating, a chance to participate in elite society, but also a risk of making social mistakes that would mark them as outsiders. The evenings on Titanic also represented a particular moment in social history, a peak of formal Victorian and Edwardian social culture that was already beginning to fade by 1912 and would be largely swept away by the First World War and the social changes that followed. The extreme formality, the rigid gender segregation, the elaborate dress codes, all of these would become less dominant in the decades after the war as society became somewhat more democratic and casual. But in April 1912, these traditions were still very much alive and fully observed, creating evening ceremonies that represented both the best and the most absurd aspects of upper-class culture. The effort required to maintain these evening rituals was substantial, requiring time, money, physical discomfort, and constant social awareness. The women in their restrictive corsets and heavy gowns, the men in their stiff collars and formal coats, everyone was sacrificing comfort for presentation, accepting discomfort as the price of sophistication and social status. The willingness to endure this discomfort showed how deeply these social performances mattered to the people involved, how essential the maintenance of proper appearance and behaviour was to their sense of identity and belonging. But there was also genuine beauty and elegance in the evening ceremonies when they worked well. A dining room full of people in formal dress, candlelight and electric lights creating flattering illumination, the sound of orchestra music and pleasant conversation, the service smooth and professional, the food excellent and beautifully presented. In those moments, the evening ceremonies achieved something that justified the effort, creating an environment of genuine sophistication and shared enjoyment that was worth the discomfort and work required to produce it. The last passengers were in good spirits, enjoying the voyage and the company of their fellow travellers. The ship had been performing beautifully, the weather had been good, and there was a general atmosphere of satisfaction and celebration. The women wore their finest gowns and most impressive jewellery. The men were perfectly turned out in white tie. The dining room was full of conversation and laughter. The orchestra played cheerful melodies. Everything was exactly as it should be in the evening ceremonies of first-class life on the world's most luxurious ocean liner. Nobody in that elegant dining room on the evening of April 14th knew that within a few hours the ship would strike an iceberg and begin to sink. Nobody knew that this would be the last formal dinner for many of the people in that room, that their beautiful gowns and perfect formal wear would soon be soaked in freezing seawater or abandoned in the rush to reach lifeboats. Nobody knew that all the elaborate social performances and careful attention to proper dress and behaviour would prove completely irrelevant in the face of the disaster that was coming. For those few hours during dinner and the evening socialising that followed, everything was perfect, everything was sophisticated, everything was exactly as the evening ceremonies of first-class life were meant to be. The tragedy that followed makes it impossible to look back at the evening ceremonies on Titanic without sadness and irony. All that effort, all that careful attention to social presentation, all that display of wealth and sophistication, it couldn't prevent the disaster or protect the people participating in these rituals from the consequences of inadequate safety measures and human error. The beautiful gowns and impressive jewellery couldn't keep anyone warm in the freezing Atlantic water. The formal dress codes and social hierarchies dissolved in the chaos of the sinking ship, becoming irrelevant in the face of survival. But for the few days before the disaster, the evening ceremonies represented something significant and valuable to the people participating in them. A sense of order, beauty, and shared social experience that made them feel connected to each other and to the traditions of their class and culture. The evening glamour of high society on Titanic was both wonderful and absurd, impressive and excessive, a genuine achievement in creating beauty and elegance, and also a somewhat ridiculous devotion of resources and effort to social performances that existed primarily for their own sake. It represented the peak of a certain kind of luxury culture, a moment when the wealthy could create whatever social environment they wanted, and had the resources to maintain elaborate rituals purely because those rituals gave meaning and structure to their lives. It was the last flowering of Edwardian formality before the modern world swept much of it away, a final moment when people still believed that the old social order was permanent and that the evening ceremonies they participated in would continue indefinitely into the future. They were wrong about that, as history would prove just a few days later, and then again in the larger catastrophe of World War I that would follow in a few years. But for those evenings on Titanic, in those beautiful formal dining rooms and elegant lounges, surrounded by music and pleasant conversation and the best that money and tradition could provide, the passengers lived inside that belief, participating in ceremonies that seemed timeless even as they were already becoming obsolete. Now that we've established the elaborate rituals and social performances that defined first-class life on Titanic, let's talk about the actual people who were participating in these performances. Because the passenger list for the maiden voyage read like a directory of American and British wealth circa 1912. This wasn't just a collection of random rich people who happened to book tickets on the same ship. It was a concentration of genuine millionaires, industrialists, aristocrats, and social celebrities that rarely occurred outside of exclusive social events in New York or London. The combined wealth aboard Titanic's first class was probably sufficient to fund a small nation's government for a year, or to build several more Titanics, or to generally just make economists weep at the sheer concentration of capital in one floating location. At the absolute top of the wealth hierarchy aboard Titanic was Colonel John Jacob Astor IV, who was quite possibly the richest passenger on the ship, and definitely in contention for richest man in America at the time. The Astor family fortune was old by American standards, dating back to John Jacob Astor I, who'd made money in fur trading and New York real estate in the early 1800s. By 1912, the family wealth was estimated at around $87 million, which in today's money would be somewhere north of $2 billion, and that's using conservative inflation calculations that don't account for how much more purchasing power that money had in 1912. John Jacob Astor IV had inherited this fortune, and had actually increased it through his own business ventures in real estate and various investments, demonstrating that he wasn't just living off inherited wealth, but was actively engaged in accumulating more money despite already having more than he could possibly spend. Astor at 47 was travelling with his second wife, Madeline, who was 18 years old, which tells you something about both his wealth and his willingness to generate scandal in pursuit of personal happiness. He'd divorced his first wife, Ava, in 1909, which was scandalous enough in an era when divorce among the upper classes was still relatively rare and socially damaging. But marrying a teenager who was young enough to be his daughter, and doing so less than 2 years after the divorce, had caused genuine social outrage in certain circles of New York society. Some people refused to acknowledge Madeline socially, considering her an improper replacement for the first Mrs. Astor. The newlyweds had been travelling in Europe and Egypt partly to escape the social disapproval at home, and they were returning to New York aboard Titanic with Madeline pregnant with their first child together. The Astors occupied one of those absurdly expensive suites we discussed earlier, probably the one with the private promenade deck, because when you're that wealthy, you don't book standard accommodations even in first class. They travelled with a valet, a lady's maid, a nurse, and a dog, because apparently wealthy Edwardians considered servants and pets essential travel companions. Astor himself was described as courteous and unassuming despite his enormous wealth, the kind of old money restraint that came from never having to prove anything to anyone because your family name alone carried sufficient weight. He was known for his inventions and his writing, having authored a science fiction novel and holding patents for various mechanical devices, which suggests he had intellectual interests beyond simply managing his fortune. Also aboard was Benjamin Guggenheim, another American multimillionaire whose family had made their fortune in mining and smelting. The Guggenheim fortune wasn't quite as old as the Astor money, but it was substantial enough that Benjamin never needed to work for a living and could spend his time managing investments and pursuing various social and cultural interests. Guggenheim was 46 and was travelling without his wife, though with his mistress, a French singer named Léontine Aubard, which was the kind of arrangement that wealthy men of the era sometimes maintained with varying degrees of discretion. The fact that he was openly travelling with his mistress rather than his wife tells you something about the flexible morality that money could buy, at least for men. Guggenheim was known for being a bit of a dandy, someone who cared about his appearance and his style in ways that were perhaps excessive, even by the standards of wealthy Edwardians who already cared quite a bit about such things. He travelled with a valet naturally because maintaining his wardrobe and appearance apparently required professional assistance. He was described as charming and sociable, someone who enjoyed the social aspects of first-class travel and who participated actively in the evening gatherings and card games that filled the hours between meals. His presence on Titanic added to the concentration of American mining and industrial wealth that was unusually well represented on this particular voyage. Then there was Isidor Straus and his wife Ida, who owned Macy's department store in New York and were probably familiar names to more people than either Astor or Guggenheim, despite having a somewhat smaller fortune. The Strausses were in their 60s and had been married for over 40 years, a genuine love match that was apparently still going strong in an era when many upper-class marriages were more about social alliance and property than romantic attachment. They were travelling in first class but not in one of the most expensive suites, because they didn't need to prove anything through ostentatious display. Their wealth was substantial, but their style was more modest than some of the flashier millionaires aboard. Isidor Straus was a former member of Congress and a respected businessman who'd built Macy's into one of America's premier department stores. Ida was known for being devoted to her husband and for rarely travelling without him, to the point where she'd accompanied him on business trips when other wealthy wives would have stayed home. They were well liked in New York social circles, respected for their philanthropy and their genuine affection for each other, which was touching even to people who knew them primarily as business acquaintances. Their presence on Titanic was less about making a social splash, and more about simply travelling in the manner appropriate to their station. Margaret, her husband, had struck it rich in mining in Colorado, and Margaret had used that wealth to push her way into Denver society, and then into broader American social circles with the determination that old money found both admirable and somewhat vulgar. She was 44, travelling alone after touring Europe, and she was known for being outspoken and unconventional in ways that made her both entertaining and controversial, depending on who you asked. Margaret wasn't quite at the wealth level of the Astors or Guggenheims, but she had more than enough money to travel first class comfortably and to make her presence felt in the social world of the ship. She was interested in social reform and women's rights, which marked her as progressive in an era when many wealthy women focused exclusively on social activities and charitable work that didn't challenge existing power structures. She spoke multiple languages, had genuine intellectual interests, and wasn't afraid to express opinions that might not be popular with other first-class passengers. Her combination of wealth and personality made her a notable figure aboard Titanic, even before the disaster that would make her famous. The Widener family was another group of Philadelphia millionaires aboard Titanic, travelling as part of that social circuit of wealthy Americans who spent significant time in Europe attending cultural events and buying art. George Widener was a streetcar magnate whose fortune came from urban transportation systems, and he was travelling with his wife Eleanor and their son Harry, who was a bibliophile and collector of rare books. The Wideners moved in the highest circles of American society, and were exactly the kind of established wealthy family that would naturally choose to travel on Titanic's prestigious maiden voyage. The family was returning from Paris, where Harry had been acquiring additions to his book collection, spending the kind of money on old manuscripts and first editions that most people couldn't imagine spending on anything. There were also various British passengers of note, including Sir Cosmo and Lady Duff Gordon, who were titled aristocrats, though not necessarily at the top of the British wealth pyramid. Lady Duff Gordon was a famous fashion designer who went by the professional name Lucille, and who had dress houses in London, Paris, and New York. She was travelling with her husband and her secretary, and she was notable for being a working woman despite her aristocratic title, which was still relatively unusual in 1912, when wealthy women were more likely to be purely social figures than to have professional careers. Her presence on Titanic was partly business, as she'd been conducting affairs related to her fashion empire, and partly pleasure, as she and her husband enjoyed travelling in luxury. The Countess of Rothes was another titled British passenger, though her title came from her marriage to the Earl of Rothes rather than from her own family. She was travelling with her cousin and a maid, returning to England after visiting her parents in Canada. The Countess was 33 and was known in British society as attractive and charming, the kind of aristocrat who moved easily in social circles and who was welcome at the most exclusive gatherings. Her presence added to the international flavour of first class, where British and American upper classes mixed in ways that weren't always possible on land, where separate social traditions and geographic distance kept them more isolated from each other. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of White Star Line and basically the person most responsible for Titanic existing in the first place, was also aboard for the maiden voyage, which made sense since he'd want to see his company's flagship vessel perform on its first crossing. Ismay occupied one of the best suites naturally, and he moved through first-class social spaces with the confidence of someone who owned the ship, which effectively he did. His presence was somewhat complicated socially, because he was there as both a passenger and as a company official, neither fully part of the social world of wealthy passengers nor fully separate from it. Some passengers would have seen him as someone worth cultivating for business reasons, while others would have considered him merely a successful businessman rather than true social elite. Arthur Ryerson was another wealthy American aboard, a steel industry magnate travelling with his wife Emily and their children, returning from Europe after receiving news of a family tragedy. The Ryersons were old money by American standards, part of established Philadelphia society, and they moved in the same social circles as the Wideners and other East Coast elite families. They occupied one of the larger suites and participated in the formal social life of first class, while also maintaining some privacy around their family grief. There were numerous other wealthy passengers whose names might not be immediately recognizable, but who represented substantial fortunes and important social positions. Real estate developers, railroad executives, mining magnates, industrialists of various kinds, people who'd made or inherited money in the boom economy of the late 19th and early 20th century, and who had enough wealth to travel first class on prestigious ships without thinking twice about the expense. Many of these passengers knew each other from New York or Philadelphia or Chicago social circles, creating an interconnected web of social relationships that extended onto the ship. The social dynamics among these millionaire passengers were fascinating and complex. On one level, everyone in first class was supposedly equal, all part of the same elevated social world with access to the same spaces and amenities. But in practice, there were clear hierarchies based on wealth, family background, and social standing. The Astors and their ilk were at the absolute top, old money families whose social position was unquestioned. Below them were the newer industrial fortunes like the Guggenheims and Wideners, wealthy enough to move in the same spaces but without the generational prestige of the oldest families. Below them were the comfortable wealthy, people with substantial means but not the tens of millions that the top tier possessed. These hierarchies played out in subtle ways throughout the voyage. Who sat with whom at dinner, who was invited to private gatherings in the suites, who received social recognition from the most prestigious passengers, all of these were markers of social standing. People like Margaret Brown had to work harder to maintain their social position, demonstrating through their behaviour and their social skills that they belonged despite having newer money and less established social credentials. The scandal around Astor's young wife created interesting social dynamics. Some passengers would have avoided the Astors socially, disapproving of the marriage and not wanting to appear to endorse it through social recognition. Others would have cultivated the Astors precisely because of their wealth and social importance, willing to overlook the scandal for the sake of the connection. Still others probably didn't care much either way, viewing the whole thing as the private business of the Astors and not something that affected their own social standing. The variety of reactions showed how complex social navigation could be even in the relatively confined world of first-class Titanic. The presence of mistresses travelling with men who weren't their husbands was another source of potential scandal and social complication. Guggenheim travelling with his mistress was the kind of arrangement that everyone knew about, but that polite society officially pretended not to notice. Some passengers would have been genuinely scandalised by the open flouting of marriage vows and conventional morality. Others would have been more sophisticated or cynical, understanding that wealthy men often maintained mistresses and that this was just how things worked among the upper classes. The social fiction was maintained that everyone travelling in first class was respectable and proper, even when the reality was more complicated. There were also professional card players aboard Titanic, men who made their living exploiting the combination of wealth, leisure and gambling that characterised first-class life on luxury liners. These card sharps dressed well enough to pass as wealthy passengers, maintained the social graces necessary to be accepted in first-class spaces, and used their skills at cards combined with sophisticated psychological manipulation to separate rich passengers from their money. Some of the card players were outright cheaters, using various techniques to manipulate the games in their favour. Marked cards, sleight of hand, collusion with confederates, all the classic techniques of card cheating were employed when the players thought they could get away with it. Other professional gamblers played honestly, but with such superior skill that they didn't need to cheat to consistently win money from wealthy amateurs who thought they were good at cards because they won regularly in their social games at home against other amateurs. The professional players understood the mathematics of the games, the psychology of their opponents, and the importance of patience in building up to the big scores that made their profession profitable. The ship's officers were aware of these professional gamblers but had limited ability to control them. As long as the games appeared to be friendly social activities between passengers, there wasn't much the officers could do. If there were complaints about cheating, or if someone was obviously being fleeced too aggressively, the officers might intervene and suggest to the professional that it was time to find a different ship for their activities. But mostly the card sharps were left alone, parasites on the wealthy population that were tolerated as an unavoidable part of luxury travel. Some wealthy passengers genuinely enjoyed the card games and didn't mind losing money to skilled players, viewing it as the cost of entertainment. Others were more naive, not recognizing that they were playing against professionals and assuming that their losses were just bad luck rather than the predictable result of playing against superior opponents. A few passengers probably lost substantial sums during the few days of the voyage, enough money that it would matter even to wealthy people, though probably not enough to seriously damage their finances. The card games were part of the ecosystem of first-class life, extracting money from the wealthy through methods that were semi-legitimate if not entirely ethical. The gossip and social observation that constantly happened in first class created a running narrative about who was doing what with whom, who was winning or losing at cards, who was wearing the most impressive jewellery, who was being snubbed by whom, and all the other small dramas that made up shipboard social life. Women gathered during their separate social times would discuss the other passengers, analysing social dynamics with the keen observation skills that came from lifetimes of navigating complex social environments. Men in the smoking room would share information about business dealings and political connections, building networks that could be valuable after the voyage ended. Some of the gossip was genuinely scandalous, spreading stories about affairs and inappropriate behaviour and social missteps that could damage reputations if they became widely known. Other gossip was more benign, simply observations about fashion choices or personality quirks that were entertaining but not harmful. The constant flow of information and opinion created a social environment where everyone was simultaneously observer and observed, where your behaviour was constantly being noted and evaluated by people whose opinions could matter for your social standing. The servants travelling with wealthy passengers added another layer to the social dynamics. Valets, ladies' maids, nurses and other personal staff moved in their own social world among the crew and second-class accommodations, but they had detailed knowledge of their employers' private lives and behaviours that made them valuable sources of information for other passengers' servants. The servant gossip network was probably even more detailed and accurate than what the first-class passengers knew, as servants had access to private information that their employers wouldn't share publicly. Some servants were discreet, maintaining proper professional boundaries and not discussing their employers' affairs. Others were more willing to share information, particularly if they disliked their employers, or if they could trade information for social standing among the other servants. The concentration of wealth on Titanic also attracted various merchants and tradespeople who saw the passenger list as an opportunity. The ship had shops selling luxury goods, jewellery, and other high-end merchandise, and the captive audience of wealthy passengers with time to spare and money to spend made for a potentially lucrative market. The merchants operating these shops had to walk a careful line, appearing sophisticated enough to serve elite clientele, while also being deferential enough to maintain the proper merchant-customer relationship. Some passengers spent substantial sums in these shops, buying jewellery or luxury items either for themselves or as gifts, while others ignored them entirely, having enough wealth that shopping on a ship wasn't particularly interesting. The class consciousness among first-class passengers was both rigid and somewhat flexible. Everyone understood that there were social hierarchies, that some passengers were more important than others, that wealth and family background mattered enormously for social standing. But the confined space of the ship and the shared experience of the voyage created opportunities for connections that might not happen on land. Someone from a lower tier of first-class wealth might strike up a friendship with someone from the top tier, based on personality compatibility or shared interests, creating social connections that crossed the usual boundaries. These friendships might not survive return to land where normal social structures reasserted themselves, but during the voyage they were real and meaningful. The disaster that would strike the ship created a brutal leveling of the social hierarchies that had seemed so important during the voyage. When Titanic struck the iceberg and began to sink, wealth and social standing proved largely irrelevant to survival. Some very wealthy passengers died while some less wealthy passengers survived, the outcome determined by factors like physical location when the ship struck, ability to respond quickly to danger, willingness to get into lifeboats early, and ultimately just luck. John Jacob Astor, the richest man aboard, died in the sinking. Isidor and Ida Strauss both died, refusing to be separated. Benjamin Guggenheim died, reportedly dressing in his best formal wear to go down with the ship in style. Margaret Brown survived and became famous for her role in managing one of the lifeboats and advocating for rowing back to look for survivors. The loss of so many wealthy and socially prominent passengers made the Titanic disaster a major news story, beyond just the tragedy of the deaths themselves. These were people whose names appeared regularly in society pages, whose business dealings affected thousands of employees and investors, whose social activities and charitable work were covered by newspapers. Their deaths represented a significant loss not just to their families, but to the broader social and economic world they'd been part of. But before the disaster, during those few days when Titanic was sailing smoothly toward New York and everything seemed fine, the millionaire passengers were simply living their normal lives in an abnormal setting. They were eating elaborate meals, socializing according to the complex rules of their class, participating in the rituals and performances that defined upper-class life, and generally enjoying the luxury that their wealth afforded them. They were human beings with the full range of human interests and concerns, not just walking symbols of Gilded Age excess. They had families they loved, business concerns that mattered to them, social relationships they valued, personal interests and hobbies they enjoyed. They happened to be extremely wealthy, but they were also just people trying to have a pleasant voyage across the Atlantic on the finest ship ever built. The millionaire passengers on Titanic represented a particular moment in American and global economic history, a peak of individual wealth concentration that existed between the robber baron era of the late 1800s and the more regulated capitalism that would emerge in the 20th century. They were products of an economic system that allowed for the accumulation of enormous personal fortunes with relatively little regulation or taxation. They enjoyed that wealth in ways that were both admirable, through philanthropy and cultural patronage, and excessive, through conspicuous consumption and social exclusion. They were neither purely heroes nor purely villains, just wealthy people living according to the values and expectations of their time and class. The social world they created aboard Titanic, with all its hierarchies and performances and gossipy drama, was a microcosm of Gilded Age elite society. It was sophisticated and cultured, but also rigid and exclusive. It valued beauty and elegance, but also spent enormous resources on pure display rather than on solving social problems. It created genuine human connections and friendships, but within boundaries carefully policed to maintain class distinctions. It was in many ways the peak of what money could buy in 1912. Comfort, luxury, social prestige, and temporary escape from normal life into a floating palace where wealth could create almost any environment desired. The fact that all of this wealth and social sophistication couldn't prevent the disaster that was coming, couldn't protect the passengers from the consequences of inadequate safety measures and human overconfidence, adds a tragic dimension to the millionaire passenger's story. Their wealth bought them the best accommodations on the ship, but it couldn't buy them adequate lifeboats or guarantee their survival. Their social standing meant nothing to the ocean or the iceberg. Their carefully maintained hierarchies and social performances dissolved in the chaos of the sinking ship. In the end, despite all their money and power and social importance, they were just people trying to survive a catastrophic failure, and many of them didn't make it. The millionaire passengers of Titanic remind us that wealth can buy many things, but it can't buy immunity from disaster or from the fundamental vulnerability that comes with being human in a dangerous world. Here's the thing about Titanic that makes the whole story particularly tragic and ironic. While all those millionaires were eating 11-course dinners and exercising on electric camels, and generally living in unprecedented luxury, the ship they were on had some fundamental design and safety flaws that would prove catastrophic. The contrast between the opulent interiors and the inadequate safety measures is so stark it almost seems intentional. Like someone was trying to make a philosophical point about human hubris and the limits of technology. But nobody was trying to make a point. They were just building and operating a ship according to the standards and priorities of 1912, which turned out to be insufficient for the situation that would develop on the night of April 14th. Thomas Andrews was the naval architect who designed Titanic, and he was aboard for the maiden voyage, as was standard practice for designers to observe how their ships performed in actual operation and to note any issues that needed addressing. Andrews was by all accounts a genuinely skilled and conscientious designer who cared about his work and wanted to create the best possible ships. He'd worked for Harland and Wolff Shipyard in Belfast for his entire career, rising from apprentice to managing director and head of the design department through actual competence rather than just family connections, though being the nephew of Lord Peary who ran the shipyard probably didn't hurt his career prospects. During the voyage, Andrews was constantly making observations about the ship's performance and noting small issues that needed correction. He walked the decks taking notes about details that weren't quite right, problems that needed fixing, improvements that could be made. He noticed that the coat hooks in the staterooms were too few and suggested adding more. He observed that the writing desk in the lounge was positioned awkwardly and recommended moving it. He noted that certain areas needed better lighting. These were small concerns, the kind of fine-tuning you'd expect on a maiden voyage, not fundamental design flaws. Andrews was doing his job, paying attention to the details that would make the ship better for passengers and crew. But there were larger issues with Titanic's design that Andrews either didn't recognize as problems or couldn't address within the constraints of the project. The watertight compartments, for instance, weren't actually watertight in the way that term suggests to modern people. They extended up through several decks, but they didn't reach all the way to the top of the hull, which meant that if enough compartments flooded, water could spill over the tops of the bulkheads and into adjacent compartments. The ship could theoretically stay afloat with up to 4 compartments flooded, which seemed like plenty of safety margin, but if more than 4 flooded, the ship would sink. This was known to the designers but was considered acceptable risk, given that scenarios requiring more than 4 flooded compartments seemed unlikely. The hull design itself was a compromise between various competing priorities. Making the hull stronger would have required more steel, which would increase weight and cost and potentially reduce cargo capacity and passenger space. The rivets holding the hull plates together were a mix of steel and iron, with iron rivets used in some areas because they were cheaper and because the steel supplies available weren't sufficient for the entire ship. These iron rivets were more brittle than steel rivets and more likely to fail under stress, which is exactly what happened when the ship struck the iceberg. The collision popped rivets and opened seams in the hull, allowing water to flood in through a series of narrow openings that together created enough damage to doom the ship. The steel used in the hull was of good quality by 1912 standards, but it had high sulfur content that made it more brittle in cold temperatures, which is unfortunate when you're building a ship that will operate in the North Atlantic, where water temperatures regularly drop to near freezing. Modern metallurgical analysis of Titanic steel has shown that it was prone to brittle fracture in cold conditions, meaning that the hull was more vulnerable to damage from impacts in the exact environment where the ship operated. This wasn't known in 1912 because the science of metallurgy wasn't advanced enough to understand these properties, so nobody involved in building Titanic knew that the steel might not perform well in cold water. But the most obvious and most discussed safety flaw on Titanic was the simple fact that the ship didn't have enough lifeboats. This wasn't an oversight or a mistake. It was a deliberate choice based on regulations that were outdated and on priorities that valued deck space and aesthetics over maximum safety capacity. Let's talk. Titanic carried 20 lifeboats, 14 standard wooden lifeboats, 2 smaller emergency cutters, and 4 Engelhardt collapsible boats with canvas sides. The total capacity of all these boats was about 178 people, which sounds reasonable until you remember that the ship was carrying over 2,200 passengers and crew on the maiden voyage. Even if every lifeboat was filled to capacity, which they weren't, and even if they were launched perfectly, which they weren't, there was only enough lifeboat space for about half the people aboard. This wasn't a secret or a surprise. Everyone involved in building and operating the ship knew exactly how many lifeboats there were, and how many people they could hold. The British Board of Trade regulations that governed lifeboat requirements were based on a ship's gross tonnage, not on the number of people aboard, which meant that the regulations hadn't kept pace with the increasing size of ships. Under these regulations, a ship of Titanic's size was required to carry at least 16 lifeboats, with a minimum capacity of 962 people. Titanic actually exceeded this requirement by carrying 20 boats with capacity for 1,178 people, which meant that White Star Line was technically in full compliance with safety regulations, while still providing inadequate lifeboat capacity for the actual number of people who might be aboard. The regulations were clearly insufficient, but they were the law, and following them meant that legally White Star Line had done nothing wrong. The design of Titanic actually included davits that could hold additional lifeboats. The ship could have carried up to 64 boats total, which would have provided enough capacity for everyone aboard and then some. But White Star Line chose not to install all those boats for several reasons. First, the regulations didn't require it, and businesses generally don't spend money on safety measures beyond what's legally required unless there's some compelling reason. Second, the lifeboats took up valuable deck space that could be used for promenading, which passengers enjoyed and which contributed to the luxury experience that was the ship's selling point. Third, and perhaps most tellingly, having too many lifeboats might actually suggest to passengers that the ship was dangerous, that all those boats were necessary because the ship might actually sink. The marketing around Titanic and her sister ship Olympic had emphasized that they were practically unsinkable, which was true in the sense that the watertight compartment design made them very resilient compared to earlier ships. But if the ship was truly unsinkable, why would you need lifeboats for everyone? The lifeboats were really just a formality, a regulatory requirement that had to be satisfied, but that would never actually be needed in any realistic scenario. At least that was the thinking. This confidence in the ship's safety wasn't limited to marketing materials or passenger perceptions. It was shared by many of the people who designed, built, and operated the vessel. The watertight compartment design was genuinely advanced for its time. The ship was huge and stable, unlikely to be seriously affected by weather or normal maritime hazards. The wireless telegraph meant that help could be summoned if problems arose. The ship was built by one of the world's best shipyards using the latest techniques and materials. Everything about Titanic's design and construction suggested that this was an exceptionally safe ship, perhaps the safest large passenger ship ever built. The idea that it might sink on its maiden voyage in calm weather from hitting an iceberg would have seemed absurdly unlikely to everyone involved. But here's where we get into the philosophical dimensions of the Titanic story, the aspects that make it more than just a maritime disaster and turn it into a meditation on human hubris and the limits of technology. Because Titanic represented the peak of early 20th century confidence in human capability to master nature through engineering and industry. This was an era of enormous technological optimism, a time when it seemed like every problem could be solved through better engineering, when human ingenuity was constantly pushing boundaries and achieving things that previous generations had considered impossible. Electricity was transforming daily life. Automobiles were replacing horses. Airplanes were beginning to fly. Cities were building skyscrapers. And ships like Titanic were crossing oceans in unprecedented comfort and safety. The builders and operators of Titanic genuinely believed they had conquered the ocean, that they'd built a ship so advanced and so safe that the traditional dangers of sea travel no longer applied. The ship was too big to be seriously affected by waves, too well designed to founder from damage, too modern to be at risk from the hazards that had threatened earlier vessels. This confidence wasn't entirely unjustified, as Titanic really was a remarkable achievement in shipbuilding. But it was also overconfident, insufficiently aware that nature doesn't care about human engineering achievements, and that the ocean can destroy anything humans build if conditions align in the wrong way. The iceberg that Titanic struck on the night of April 14, 1912, was just a piece of ice floating in the ocean, following ocean currents and wind patterns that had been moving ice through the North Atlantic for millions of years before humans existed. It wasn't trying to sink the ship, It wasn't intelligently opposing human mastery of the ocean, it was just there, indifferent to the technological marvel that was about to collide with it. The fact that this stupid piece of ice destroyed what was supposedly the safest ship ever built, killed over 1,500 people, and ended careers and bankrupted companies, and became one of the most famous disasters in history, all while just floating along doing what ice does, is almost funny in a dark cosmic joke kind of way. The contrast between the luxury aboard Titanic and the vulnerability of everyone on it is striking when you think about the details. Passengers in first class were eating oysters and drinking champagne, and wearing diamond necklaces worth more than most people earned in their lifetimes, all while floating on a ship that didn't have enough lifeboats for them if something went wrong. They were exercising in a gymnasium with electric camels while the ship's hull was made of steel that became brittle in cold water. They were taking heated baths in Turkish bathhouses while the wireless operators were too busy sending their personal messages to adequately process ice warnings from other ships. The whole setup was a study in misplaced priorities, focusing enormous resources on luxury and comfort, while accepting inadequate safety measures that met legal requirements, but weren't actually sufficient for worst-case scenarios. This wasn't unique to Titanic. It was characteristic of how elite society in the early 20th century approached risk and safety. Wealthy people were accustomed to having their comfort and convenience prioritized over almost everything else. They expected and received luxury accommodations even in challenging environments, and they'd come to assume that money and technology could protect them from danger. The idea that they might be vulnerable despite their wealth, and despite the advanced technology around them, wasn't something they really considered, because their life experiences suggested that money could solve almost any problem and that technology was constantly making life safer and more comfortable. The passengers and crew on Titanic were living inside a bubble of technological optimism that was about to burst in the most brutal way possible. They believed they were on an unsinkable ship travelling in safety as well as luxury, protected by modern engineering from the dangers that had threatened earlier generations of ocean travellers. This faith was reinforced by everything they could see around them: the magnificent ship, the advanced systems, the professional crew, the smooth operation of everything during the early days of the voyage. He was proud of what he'd designed, rightfully so given that Titanic really was a remarkable achievement in shipbuilding. But he was also human and limited by the knowledge and standards of his time. He didn't know that the steel would be brittle in cold water. He didn't fully appreciate the risk of the watertight compartments not extending all the way up. He accepted the lifeboat capacity as adequate because it exceeded regulations and because he, like everyone else, believed the ship was so well designed that catastrophic sinking was essentially impossible. When the ship struck the iceberg at 11:40 p.m. on April 14th, Andrews was one of the first people to understand how serious the damage was. He inspected the flooding and did quick calculations about how long the ship could stay afloat with 6 compartments breached. And he realized that Titanic was going to sink, probably within a couple of hours. This knowledge must have been devastating for him, understanding that his creation, this ship he'd poured years of work into, was going to founder on its maiden voyage, taking hundreds or thousands of people with it. By all accounts, he spent his final hours helping passengers and crew, urging people to put on lifebelts and get to the boats, doing what he could to save lives even though he knew the ship was doomed. The insufficient lifeboat capacity meant that even perfect evacuation would have left hundreds of people aboard when the ship sank. In practice, the evacuation was far from perfect. Many of the lifeboats were launched partially filled because crew members were worried about the David's capacity to lower fully loaded boats, and because many passengers initially didn't believe the ship was in serious danger and were reluctant to leave the warm, well-lit ship for a small boat on the dark, cold ocean. Some lifeboats that could hold 65 people left with 20 or 30 aboard, wasting capacity that could have saved lives. The class divisions that had defined the social world of the ship also played out during the evacuation, though in more complicated ways than simple "first class got priority" narratives suggest. First-class passengers had advantages in the evacuation. Their accommodations were closer to the boat deck where the lifeboats were located. They had better information about what was happening, because they had more contact with officers and crew, and some crew members did prioritize getting first-class passengers into boats. But first class also had the disadvantage that some wealthy passengers, particularly men, felt social pressure to give up their lifeboat spaces to women and children, following the women and children first protocol that was a strong social norm even if it wasn't an absolute rule. The result was that survival rates varied significantly by class, but not in the straightforward way you might expect. First-class women had very high survival rates, around 97%, because they were prioritized for lifeboats and because they were able to reach the boat deck easily. Third-class women had much lower survival rates, around 46%, because they faced barriers getting from their accommodations to the boat deck, and because by the time many of them reached the lifeboats, the boats were gone. First-class men had survival rates around 33%, higher than other classes of men but still meaning 2/3 of them died. Third-class men had survival rates around 16%, showing clear disadvantage but also showing that some did survive. Crew members had survival rates around 24%, varying significantly depending on their specific duties during the evacuation. The disaster revealed the limitations of the luxury and technology that had seemed so impressive during the voyage. The heated swimming pool and Turkish baths and elaborate dining rooms and all the other amenities that made first-class travel luxurious turned out to be irrelevant when the ship was sinking. The grand staircase that had been so impressive as a social stage became a route for water flooding into the ship's interior as it tilted and went under. The electric lights that had illuminated the ship so beautifully stayed on until very near the end, which was actually quite remarkable and made the evacuation easier, but they couldn't prevent the disaster or compensate for inadequate lifeboats. The wireless telegraph system, which had been marketed as a safety feature, did allow Titanic to send distress calls that brought other ships to rescue survivors, which saved hundreds of lives. But the wireless operators had been too busy with passenger message traffic to properly process and prioritize ice warnings from other ships, which might have helped Titanic avoid the iceberg in the first place. The technology was useful but not sufficient, a tool that could help but that also had limitations and that depended on human operators making correct decisions about priorities. The watertight compartment system, which was supposed to make the ship practically unsinkable, did allow Titanic to stay afloat for over 2.5 hours after the collision, giving time for evacuation that saved many lives. But the system wasn't designed to handle the specific type of damage that occurred, and it ultimately failed to prevent the sinking. The engineering was sophisticated but not perfect, advanced but not sufficient to overcome the vulnerability inherent in being a floating structure in a dangerous environment. The philosophical dimension of the Titanic disaster is about the gap between human confidence and human limitation, between what we think we can control and what actually remains beyond our control. The builders of Titanic believed they had mastered the ocean through engineering and technology. They were wrong, not because their engineering was bad, but because the ocean is fundamentally indifferent to human engineering, and because perfect safety is impossible in any dangerous environment. We can reduce risk, we can build better ships, we can implement better safety measures, but we can't eliminate vulnerability entirely. This lesson has been learned and relearned throughout human history, in disasters ranging from Titanic to Challenger to Fukushima to countless other cases where human confidence in technology proved to be overconfident. We build increasingly sophisticated systems that are genuinely impressive achievements, but we also tend to underestimate the possibility of failure and to accept risk levels that in hindsight seem clearly inadequate. The people who built and operated Titanic weren't stupid or negligent. They were working within the knowledge and standards of their time, but those standards turned out to be insufficient. The contrast between the luxury aboard Titanic and the disaster that destroyed the ship also raises questions about priorities and resource allocation. The ship cost about $7.5 million to build in 1912 money, with substantial portions of that cost going to the elaborate first-class accommodations and amenities. Installing enough lifeboats for everyone aboard would have cost a tiny fraction of that amount, probably less than the cost of the grand staircase alone. But the choice was made to invest heavily in luxury and minimally in safety beyond regulatory requirements, reflecting priorities that valued passenger comfort and competitive advantage over maximum safety margins. This isn't to say that luxury is bad or that resources spent on beauty and comfort are wasted. The first-class accommodations on Titanic represented genuine achievement in design and craftsmanship, creating environments that were beautiful and that brought pleasure to the people who experienced them. But the balance between investing in luxury and investing in safety was clearly wrong, prioritizing visible amenities that could be marketed to passengers over less visible safety measures that would only matter in an emergency that everyone assumed wouldn't happen. The modern cruise industry learned from the Titanic disaster and many subsequent maritime accidents, implementing much stricter safety regulations, including requirements for lifeboat capacity to exceed the maximum number of passengers and crew, mandatory safety drills, improved hull design, better communication systems, and numerous other measures designed to prevent similar disasters. Modern cruise ships are much safer than Titanic was, with lower fatality rates despite carrying far more passengers. The technological and regulatory progress since 1912 has made ocean travel much less dangerous than it was in the early 20th century. But the fundamental lesson of Titanic remains relevant. Technology can reduce risk but can't eliminate it. Human confidence can exceed human capability, and nature remains indifferent to human achievements no matter how impressive they might be. The ocean that Titanic sailed on is the same ocean that exists today, operating according to the same physical laws, indifferent to human preferences and human engineering. We're better the people. They were eating elaborate meals and wearing expensive clothes and socializing according to complex social rules, while floating on a ship that didn't have enough lifeboats for them if something went wrong. The disco,